You lie in your bunk, suspended in the deep stillness of a whaling vessel that has not moved for many weeks. The ship is locked fast in a frozen sea, far above the Arctic Circle, during the long night that holds sway from autumn into winter without a single sunrise to break its grip. Around you the wooden hull rests in ice so thick and so old that it presses inward with a constant, patient pressure, and the only sound that reaches your ears is not the slap of water or the groan of a turning hull, but the immense quiet of a world paused. In this darkness, the notion of time becomes fluid, measured not by clocks, but by the slow rhythms of your own body and the soft repeating tasks of the crew who share this floating wooden home. Your bunk is a narrow rectangle built against the curved inner planking of the foremast section, a space just wide enough for a grown man to lie flat and turn from side to side with care. Above you hangs a rectangle of heavy canvas, slung from hooks to keep the draft from settling directly on your face, and beneath it the air is warm enough from your own breath to be bearable. You have lain here through the sleep period, which in this eternal night is marked only by the ship's bell ringing half-hour increments from the deck, a sound so distant and muffled by the walls that it feels more like a memory of sound than the thing itself. The bell has rung countless times while you drifted, and you've counted none of them. The blankets over your body are thick wool, layered in a careful sequence. Next to your skin is a long-sleeved undershirt of soft flannel, buttoned at the throat, and over that a heavier woolen smock that once belonged to the ship's cooper. Your legs are wrapped in 2 pairs of long drawers, and your feet are buried in heavy socks that your own mother knitted before you shipped out, the yarn still holding a faint oily smell of the lanolin that keeps them from becoming stiff. On top of this, you have pulled a blanket woven from the coarse hair of mountain goats, traded for tobacco in a port you can barely remember, and over that a quilt patched from worn-out sailcloth and lined with an old wool coat that had become too frayed for use on deck. The weight of all these layers presses you down into the straw-filled mattress in a way that feels protective rather than heavy, and the heat your body generates is trapped efficiently within the nest you have built. Your eyes open not to light, but to the faintest possible glow, a tiny smudge of amber that hovers in the darkness somewhere near your right shoulder. This is the whale oil lamp that hangs from a nail driven into the overhead beam, a small tin fixture with a single wick turned low. It burns night and day, never extinguished, because in this floating world a flame represents more than illumination. It is a sign of life, a marker that the ship's heart still beats even when every other sign of motion has ceased. The lamp swings with a nearly imperceptible movement, perhaps a half-inch left and then right, set into motion by some distant shift of the ice against the hull, and the tiny pendulum arc makes the shadows in your corner writhe lazily. You watch the glow without intention, your mind still half submerged in the fog of sleep, and the longer you watch, the more the darkness seems to settle into familiar shapes: the beam overhead, the curved rib of the ship's frame, the footlocker at the end of your bunk, with its brass latch turned green from years of salt air. The smell of the foxhole is a quiet presence in itself, never loud, but always there. It is a blend of cold wood, lamp-black from the wick, the faintly sweet tang of whale oil that has been rendered and cooled, and the musty undercurrent of wool that has absorbed the breath and sweat of many men over many months. There is a trace of pipe tobacco embedded in the timber, a reminder of evenings when the crew would gather and smoke before the endless night made such gatherings feel like distant memories. All of these smells combine into something neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply the smell of home, the smell of a world reduced to a single ship locked in ice. You become aware of your own breathing, the slow rise and fall of your chest against the layered blankets. Each exhale sends a faint puff of vapor past your lips, visible even in the weak lamplight, and you note without alarm that the temperature inside the sleeping quarters is cold enough to freeze the moisture of your breath into a brief, tiny cloud that dissipates against the canvas overhead. You lie still for a long while, allowing the awareness of the ship to seep into your limbs. The vessel does not rock. It does not sway with the memory of waves. The great keel is held immobile in a medium that has the consistency of stone, and the ship's masts rise straight up into a sky that holds no wind at all. This absence of motion is so complete that after the first few days of being frozen in, the crew experienced a strange sickness of equilibrium, a sense that the world itself had forgotten how to move. Now, after weeks of stillness, your body has adapted and finds the motionlessness to be a kind of rest that no rocking cradle could ever provide. You listen. From beyond the thin wooden partition that separates your quarters from the next compartment comes the faint, rhythmic breathing of another sleeping crewman, a sound so steady and so soft that it blends into the quiet like a stream into a pond. Farther off, somewhere near the galley, you can make out the occasional plink of a pot being shifted, a muted footfall on the deck planks, the sound of someone moving with the deliberate slowness of a person who has no need to hurry. The ship is alive, but its life is a whisper, a series of tiny sounds that would be lost in any other environment. Then, threading through all these near sounds, you hear the one sound that you have come to associate with the waking period, a soft, measured thud, followed by a crisp slicing noise, repeating every few seconds from somewhere above your head. It is the carpenter, already at work on the main deck, shaping the replacement mast with his adze. The sound travels through the wood of the hull and the deck beams, reaching your ears with a muffled clarity that makes it feel as though the ship itself is breathing in the rhythm of the tool. Thunk and slice. Pause. Thunk and slice. Pause, thunk and slice. The carpenter does not rush, and his strokes are so evenly spaced that you could set a watch by them if you cared to. The noise is not intrusive. It is as gentle as a heartbeat, as steady as the dripping of melt water into a tin cup, and you lie there for a little while longer, simply listening to it. At last, with the patience of one who knows there is no dawn waiting to hurry you along, you begin to extract yourself from the bedclothes. The process is slow and methodical. First, you fold back the sailcloth quilt, taking care not to disturb the arrangement of the other blankets more than necessary, because the cold air that rushes in to replace your body heat is sharp and immediate. You pause to let your skin adjust, then you push down the goat hair blanket as well. The cold touches your arms through the wool sleeves, a sensation that is less an ache and more a gentle reminder that you are alive in a place where the temperature hovers far below the freezing point of water, even inside the insulated hull. You sit up, and your head brushes the canvas draft cover, setting it swinging ever so slightly. Your legs swing over the edge of the bunk, and your wool-stockinged feet find the wooden deck planks. The wood is cold even through the thick socks, a deep cold that speaks of the ice pressing against the outer hull only a few feet away. You sit for a moment on the edge of the bunk, letting your body gather itself. The lamp still swings. The carpenter still adzes. The quiet still holds. You stand, and the deck feels solid and true beneath you, a reminder that the ship was built in a yard where the oak was seasoned for years before being shaped. You reach for the heavy canvas trousers that hang from a peg near the lamp, their fabric stiff with cold. You pull them on one leg at a time, buttoning the waist slowly, and then you fetch the woolen overcoat that has been your constant companion since the ship first entered the ice. The coat is dark blue, patched at the elbows with brown cloth, and its weight settles over your shoulders like a familiar burden. You wrap a long scarf around your neck, the scarf your wife knitted, its stitches uneven in places but warm nonetheless, and you pull a woolen cap down over your ears. Every action is performed with the same unhurried deliberation. There is no reason to move quickly, there is nowhere to go but the deck, and the carpenter's work will continue regardless of when you arrive. You lace your boots, which are made of thick leather lined with felt, and you blow into your cupped hands to warm the fingertips before drawing on a pair of wool mittens. The mittens are connected by a long cord that passes through the sleeves of your coat so that you cannot lose them in the dark. You turn to the lamp and raise the wick slightly, just enough to see the space more clearly. The forecastle is small, with 4 bunks built into the walls and a central table bolted to the deck. The table holds a communal lantern, a tin of tobacco, and a journal in which someone has been recording the days, though the entries have grown sparse. You do not pause to read it. Instead, you cross to the ladder that leads upward, a steep set of wooden rungs vanishing into a dark square opening overhead. You place your mitted hand on the first rung. The wood is smooth from many hands before yours, and the cold of it seeps through the wool to remind you of the temperature waiting above. You begin to climb, one rung at a time, and with each upward step, the sound of the carpenter's adze grows slightly louder and clearer. The thunk and slice rhythm becomes less a feeling transmitted through the hull and more a distinct auditory presence somewhere ahead. The air moving down the companionway is noticeably colder, and you feel it on your cheeks as though the darkness itself were a cool breath exhaled by the polar night. You pause halfway up the ladder, not from weariness but from a kind of appreciation of the moment. The ship around you is silent except for the carpenter, and the narrow shaft of the companionway creates a small column of air that moves slowly downward, carrying the smell of the deck with it. This air tastes faintly of pine resin and cold metal, with an undernote of the spruce timber being shaped. You breathe it in, and then you continue to climb. Your head rises through the hatch, and the deck opens around you into a darkness that is almost complete. The only illumination comes from two shielded lanterns hanging from the mainmast, stay some distance away, casting a warm pool of light on the carpenter and his work. The rest of the deck stretches away into shadow. The try-works a dark hulk to port, the whaleboats overturned and lashed in place, the rigging rising straight up into a starless black. The cold presses against your face and tests the seams of your coat, but you do not flinch. You step off the final rung and onto the deck, your boots making a soft, dry sound on the frost-covered planks. The endless night surrounds you, patient and complete, and the carpenter continues his rhythm without interruption. The deck receives you into a darkness that is not empty, but full of shapes you have learned to recognize over the long weeks of this frozen captivity. Your boots meet the planks, and the frost that coats them makes a sound so faint it is scarcely a whisper, a soft crystalline crunch that registers more in the soles of your feet than in your ears. Above you the masts rise straight into a black so profound that the upper spars disappear entirely, vanishing as though the ship were built without tops, and the rigging that you know is there reveals itself only when you brush against a frozen shroud and feel its iron stiffness. The cold wraps around you at once, a presence that is neither aggressive nor gentle, but simply absolute. And you pull your scarf a little higher over your nose before your exhales can freeze on the wool. Your eyes turn naturally toward the only source of light. Across the deck, near the main hatch and just aft of the foremast, two shielded lanterns hang from short lengths of line tied to the mainmast stays. They burn with a steady yellow flame, their tin reflectors concentrating the glow downward into a pool of warm light that seems almost liquid in the way it spreads across the frosty deck planks. In the center of that illuminated space, the carpenter works on his knees beside the long spruce timber, and the scene is so still that it might be a painting if not for the slow, measured motion of his shoulders and the adze rising and falling in his hands. You cross the deck with the same deliberateness that got you out of your bunk, stepping around the ring bolts and the coiled lines that have been frozen into rigid loops since the first week of October. The try-works to port looms as a dark rectangular mass, its brick chimney cold and silent, the great iron pots empty of oil and crusted with a residue of last season's rendering. The whaleboats are overturned and lashed amidships, their hulls covered with a layer of canvas that crackles with frost, and you give them a wide berth out of habit rather than need. The deck itself is wide enough for a full crew to work a cutting in falls, but tonight, as on all nights now, it feels like a deserted stage where only one quiet performance is underway. You reach the edge of the lamplight and pause. The warmth of the lanterns does not reach you here. The air is exactly as cold as the rest of the deck, but the light has a psychological effect, an illusion of shelter that you appreciate without analyzing. The carpenter glances up at your approach, a brief lift of his chin that acknowledges your presence without interrupting his rhythm, and then he returns his attention to the timber. No words are exchanged, none are needed. You have come up from below many times before, and he has been here every time, and the silence between you is as comfortable as a shared blanket. You find your usual spot a few paces away from the workspace, a folded sailcloth that has been laid across a low wooden grating near the bulwark. The sailcloth is stiff with cold and crackles when you settle onto it, but it insulates you from the deck and gives your body a defined place to be still. You arrange your coat beneath you, leaning your back against the solid oak of the bulwark timber, and you draw your knees up slightly so that your arms can rest across them. From this position you can watch the carpenter's work without craning your neck, and the lanterns paint his moving figure in warm tones against the infinite dark behind him. The workspace itself is a model of deliberate order. The carpenter has cleared a rectangle of deck some 10 feet long and 6 feet wide, sweeping the frost away with a stiff bristled brush until the wood underneath shows its age-darkened grain. At each end of this rectangle rests a heavy wooden chock shaped like a truncated pyramid with a U-shaped notch cut into its top face. The spruce timber lies across these chocks, its squared sides still showing the marks of the pit saw that milled it months ago in a forest you will never see. The timber is perhaps 12 feet long and 14 inches on each side, a substantial piece of wood that will become the new topmast once the carpenter has finished shaping it. Its weight is such that it took 4 men to lift it from the hold, and it is supported now at exactly the right height for a man to work on his knees. Scattered around the chocks are the carpenter's other tools, each in its assigned place. A heavy wooden mallet rests on a folded piece of canvas to keep its head from touching the cold deck. Its handle is worn smooth by years of gripping, the wood stained dark with oil from the carpenter's hands. A draw knife with 2 handles and a long, straight blade lies parallel to the timber, its edge protected by a leather sheath that is unbuckled now but ready to be fastened at a moment's notice. A steel wedge and a small pry bar share a corner of the canvas, the pry bar's curved end hooked over the edge of a decked plank so it cannot roll. Nearby is the carpenter's canvas tool roll, unbound to reveal chisels of different widths, a wooden folding ruler, a small brass square, and a whetstone in a leather pouch. A bucket of frozen wood shavings serves as a temporary stand for a tin mug of tea gone cold hours ago. Everything is arranged with the precision of a man who knows that in the dark and the cold, misplacing a tool means wasted time and frozen fingers. The carpenter himself kneels on a padded burlap sack that protects his knees from the deck. He wears heavy woolen trousers patched at the knees with squares of canvas that have been sewn on with tarred twine, and his upper body is wrapped in a thick coat similar to your own, its collar turned up to cover his neck. His hands are protected by mittens of brown wool, but the right mitten has been modified. The thumb and the first 2 fingers are cut off at the knuckle, leaving the fingertips bare so he can feel the tool. The exposed fingertips are reddened with cold, but he flexes them often and tucks them into his armpit for a few seconds when the chill becomes too keen. On his head sits a woolen cap pulled low, and around his neck is a scarf of dark grey wool that he sometimes pulls up over his mouth, though at this moment it rests loosely at his throat. His beard, which has grown long over the months of the voyage, is frosted white where his breath condenses, giving him the look of a figure from an old folk tale. The adze in his hands is the principal tool of this long night's work. It is a beautiful and practical thing, a curved steel blade with a cutting edge about 4 inches wide, set at a right angle to a hickory handle that curves slightly in the middle to give the hands a better grip. The blade is kept sharp enough to shave the wood in thin curls, and the carpenter hones it regularly on the whetstone he keeps close by. The handle is smooth and dark with the accumulated oil of countless hours of use, and there is a small notch near the end where a lanyard can be tied to hang the tool from a belt, though at the moment it swings freely in the carpenter's 2-handed grip. You watch as he positions himself at the timber's head end, where the first few feet have already begun to lose their square corners and take on a faintly rounded shape. He holds the adze with his left hand near the blade and his right hand at the end of the handle, and he swings it in a short controlled arc that rises no higher than his shoulder. The blade meets the wood with a soft, hollow thunk, sliding forward just a fraction of an inch before the carpenter pulls it back, and a shaving of spruce curls away from the timber and falls into the growing pile on the deck. The sound is distinct. The initial impact of steel on wood, followed by the sliding release as the shaving separates, and then the quiet pause as the tool is lifted and repositioned for the next stroke. It happens in less than 2 seconds, but the rhythm stretches each moment into something longer, something that holds your attention without demanding it. Thunk and slice, pause, thunk and slice. The carpenter moves the adze blade a finger's width to the left or right after every few strokes, working in a methodical pattern that covers a strip of the timber surface before he shifts his knees and begins the next strip. He does not hurry, and he does not slow down. His pace is exactly the same now as it was when you first heard him from your bunk, and you know from experience that it will be exactly the same an hour from now when the ship's bell rings the mid-watch and the cook brings up another kettle of hot water. This constancy is the gift of a skilled craftsman, the ability to find a rhythm that the body can sustain indefinitely without fatigue or error. The shavings that fall from the adze are pale and thin, curling like apple peels. In the lamplight, they take on a warm golden hue, though in daylight they would be nearly white. They fall onto the deck around the carpenter's knees, joining the thick carpet that has been growing since the work began. The shavings are brittle from the cold and snap easily, so the carpenter takes care not to step on them until he is ready to sweep them into the canvas sack. Every now and then he pauses in his adzing, rests the tool across his thighs, and uses his bare fingertips to pick up a handful of shavings and drop them into the sack. The sack itself is a large cylinder of canvas with a rope drawstring at the top, and it stands open beside the chocks, already half full. The carpenter pats the shavings down as he adds them, making room for more, and the patting sound is a softer, duller note in the quiet symphony of the deck. You shift slightly on your folded sailcloth, drawing your coat tighter around your shoulders without taking your eyes off the work. The lamplight flickers once, a tiny flutter caused by a draft that has found its way across the deck from the companionway hatch. The carpenter notices the same flicker and pauses, looking up at the lanterns with an expressionless face. The draft passes, the flames steady themselves, and he returns to the adzime without comment. This is the extent of excitement on the deck. A candle's waver, a moment's stillness, and then the resumption of the rhythm. The cold is a steady companion now, not worsening but not retreating. It numbs the tip of your nose and the edges of your ears where the wall cap does not cover them, and you are aware of it in the way you are aware of your own heartbeat as a background condition that requires no action. You have learned that fighting the cold is useless. You simply accept it and let your body do what it knows how to do, which is to keep the core warm and let the extremities manage as they can. Your feet, encased in their leather boots and thick socks, are still warm enough that you can wiggle your toes, and you do so occasionally, a tiny private exercise that keeps the blood moving. Your hands, tucked into the opposite sleeves of your coat, are warm inside their mittens, and you resist the urge to pull them out and cup them around your face, knowing that exposure would only speed the heat's departure. Time passes in the way it always passes during the endless night, without markers, without urgency. The ship's bell rings the half hour from somewhere in the darkness forward, a single clear note that hangs in the cold air for a long moment and then fades. The carpenter does not react to the bell. He may not even hear it anymore. So deeply is he absorbed in his work. You count the strokes out of habit, a remnant of your life on a ship that once moved through time as well as space, but the number slips away almost at once, crowded out by the adze's own counting system. After a period that might be 15 minutes or might be an hour, you have no way to know and no need to know. The carpenter pauses in a way that signals a deliberate break. He sets the adze down across the timber, blade facing away from him, and he straightens his back slowly, vertebrae by vertebrae, until he is half sitting on his heels. He lets out a slow breath that plumes white in the lamplight, and he flexes his bare fingers, curling them into a fist, and then spreading them wide several times. The joints crackle softly, a sound like distant ice shifting. He reaches for his tin mug, finds the tea frozen solid, and sets it down again without any change of expression. Then he turns his head and looks at you, and you meet his gaze across the lamplit space. He does not smile. His face, half hidden by the frosted beard, is calm and steady. He simply nods, a tiny dip of the chin that says the same thing it always says: the work goes on, the night goes on, and we are still here together. After the nod, he picks up the whetstone from his tool roll, moistens it with a few drops of oil from a small bottle, and begins to hone the adze blade. The stone moves in small, tight circles across the curved steel, making a soft ringing sound that is higher pitched than the adzing, a companion note. He works the stone along the full length of the cutting edge, testing the sharpness with the pad of his thumb every few seconds, and when he is satisfied, he wipes the blade clean with a rag and sets the stone aside. This maintenance ritual takes perhaps 5 minutes, and you watch it with the same calm attention you have given to the adzing, finding in the circular motion of the stone a different but equally restful pattern. The carpenter returns the adze to his hands, shifts his knees on the burlap pad, and resumes the shaping. The timber has changed in the time you have been watching. The squared corner at the near end is now visibly rounded, the flat plane giving way to a curve that will eventually form a perfect circle when viewed from the end. The transition is subtle, a matter of fractions of an inch removed, one shaving at a time, but the accumulation of those fractions has become noticeable. You let your eyes trace the line of the timber from the rounded end to the still square middle, and you understand the journey the carpenter is making, a slow migration from rough stock to finished spar that will take many more hours of this same patient rhythm. The lanterns continue to burn, their reservoirs of whale oil slowly dropping, their wicks drawing fuel upward through capillary action that operates even in this cold. The frost on the deck beyond the lamplight remains undisturbed, a uniform white crust that sparkles very faintly when you look at it from the corner of your eye. The sky above the bare masts is invisible, not because it is cloudy, but because there is no light to define it, no moon or star bright enough to penetrate the long dark of the polar winter. You remember that somewhere beyond this darkness, the sun is moving in its own steady arc, preparing to return in a few months, but the thought is abstract, like the memory of a place you visited once and may never visit again. You settle deeper into your sailcloth seat, feeling the solid weight of the ship beneath you and the quiet companionship of the carpenter's work in front of you. The deck is cold and dark and still, and the adze rises and falls, while the endless night holds everything in its patient, silent embrace. The tool in the carpenter's hands has a name that sounds like a whisper, the adze. You have heard it called other things in other ports of shipwrights: adze, a hollowing adze, a cooper's blade, but here on this frozen deck it is simply the adze, and its shape is so ancient that the first wooden vessels ever launched knew its touch. The blade is a curved piece of steel, forged by a smith whose name no one remembers, with a cutting edge that runs 4 inches across, honed into a crescent so sharp that it can part a paper-thin shaving from a block of spruce without tearing a single fiber. Viewed from the side, the blade has a gentle but definite curve, like a shallow bowl turned on its edge, which allows it to scoop away the wood rather than simply chip at it. The back of the blade is thicker, forged with a slight ridge that strengthens the steel where it meets the handle, and a socket or eye passes through the metal at a right angle, accepting the wooden grip and locking it in place with friction and the patient pressure of years. The handle is hickory, a wood that grows slowly in the forests far to the south, its grain as straight as a ruled line, and its nature such that it absorbs shock without ever splintering. The carpenter has told you once, in a moment of rare talk, that this handle came with the blade when he first signed on as a ship's carpenter many voyages ago, and in all that time it has never needed replacement. The hickory is darkened along its length, stained by the oils of his hands and the fine dust of 1,000 different timbers, so that the grip area is nearly black, while the ends still show a honey-brown color. A small notch has been cut near the butt end, just wide enough for a leather thong to pass through, and when the carpenter hangs the adze from his belt, the thong holds it securely and the blade dangles safely below his knee. The handle is not perfectly straight. It has a subtle S-curve carved into the midsection, offset by barely an inch, which allows the hands to hold it at an angle that keeps the knuckles clear of the timber during the cut. This curve is so subtle that you must sight along the handle from end to end to see it, as natural as the arc of a drawn bow. You watch as the carpenter takes up the adze after his brief rest, checking the blade's edge with his bare thumb before settling his hands into position. His left hand grips the handle just below the steel socket, his thumb wrapped firmly around the curve with his fingers pressing the wood into his palm. This hand controls the placement, aiming the blade at the exact spot on the timber that needs to lose its next fraction of an inch. His right hand curls around the butt of the handle, the cut-off fingers of his mitten allowing a direct feel of the hickory against his skin, and this hand controls the swing, providing the momentum and guiding the follow-through. The space between his 2 hands stays constant, roughly the width of his shoulders, and this spacing does not change whether he is taking a deep cut or a shallow finishing pass. What changes is only the height of the backswing and the speed of the descent, both of which he modulates unconsciously as a singer modulates breath. He kneels beside the spruce timber, his burlap pad protecting his knees from the frozen deck, and leans forward from his hips so that his weight rests over the work rather than behind it. His back remains straight, a posture born of long practice, and his shoulders move independently of his waist when he swings. The adze is lifted up and slightly back, the blade arcing through the cold air to a point just above his right shoulder, and then it comes down again in a motion that flows rather than strikes. There is no jerkiness at the top of the arc, no sudden acceleration. The blade descends along a curve that matches the swing's beginning, and the moment of contact with the wood is a gentle arrival rather than a collision. When the steel meets the spruce, the sound is a muted, hollow thunk that vibrates through the timber and into the deck. And in the same instant, the carpenter pushes his right hand forward just a fraction, sliding the blade along the grain for a distance no greater than the width of your thumb. This sliding motion is the secret of the adze. If you merely struck the wood and withdrew, you would make a chop, a crude notch that would splinter the grain. But by combining the downward strike with a forward glide, you peel away a continuous shaving that follows the wood's natural layers. The shaving lifts from the surface, curls over the top of the blade, and falls away to the deck, a thin ribbon of pale spruce that twists into a loose spiral as it falls. The sound of the slice is a clean, tearing whisper that follows the thunk by a fraction of a heartbeat. Thunk whisper, each stroke complete in itself and yet part of a larger pattern. After the cut, the carpenter lifts the adze back to the starting position, but he does not immediately strike again. He shifts his knees a fraction of an inch along the burlap pad, repositioning his body so that the next stroke will land beside the previous one, overlapping the faint scallop left by the last blade pass. The adze blade is slightly wider than the shaving it removes, and each cut blends into the one before it, creating a surface that is not flat like a planed board, but rippled in a subtle pattern of tiny facets. These facets catch the lantern light in different ways, some reflecting a warm gleam, while others sink into micro-shadows, and the overall effect on the rounded Mast section is a texture that looks almost woven, like the surface of a basket made from pale wood. You watch this cycle without counting at first, letting the rhythm wash over you as the lamp in the fossil washed over your waking moments. The carpenter takes perhaps 2 strokes per breath, his exhalations timed to the downward swing so that a small plume of vapor appears beside the blade at every cut. The cold makes these plumes linger a moment before dispersing, so that a ghostly ring of tiny ice crystals forms around the workspace and then fades, replenished with each breath. The temperature is so low that the steel itself has become cold enough to stick to bare skin, and this is why the carpenter tends his tool with care, never letting his bare fingers rest on the blade for more than a few seconds. After 20 strokes, the number forms in your mind only slowly, because you are not consciously counting, but your body senses the pattern. The carpenter restores the adze across his thighs, blade pointing outward and down, and straightens his back. He does this without any outward sign of fatigue. It is simply a part of the rhythm, a built-in pause as essential as the backswing. He flexes his right hand, the bare fingers curling and uncurling several times, and he looks at the section of timber he has just worked. One eye narrows slightly as he sights along the rounded surface, checking the shape of the arc, and he may run the side of his thumb down the scalloped wood to feel for any irregularity that his eyes might miss. The thumb comes away with a dusting of fine spruce powder that glitters with frozen sap crystals, and he brushes it against his trousers before reaching for the stiff bristled brush that rests near the canvas sack. The brush's bristles are boar hair set into a wooden block, short and densely packed, and the carpenter uses it to sweep the accumulated shavings off the deck and into the open mouth of the sack. He works the brush in quick, efficient strokes, drawing the shavings into a pile and then herding them over the rim of the canvas. And the sound this makes is a dry, rustling hiss that complements the deeper notes of the adzing. A few shavings have lodged in the grain of the deck planks, and he pries them out with the corner of the brush before sweeping again. The floor of his workspace is soon clear of debris, the frost underneath marked with the faint tracery of the brushstrokes, and he pats the shavings down inside the sack with the flat of his hand, before returning the brush to its spot. The pause lasts perhaps a minute, sometimes less, and then the carpenter resettles his grip on the adze and begins a new series. There is no signal to start, no external prompt. His body simply decides that the pause is over, and the tool lifts into the air with the same fluid arc as before. This time the strokes fall slightly farther down the timber, advancing along the length of the squared beam toward the middle section that has not yet been shaped. Each series of strokes shifts the carpenter's position by an inch or two, so that over many series he migrates slowly along the timber, like a tide moving across a sand flat. When he reaches the far end of the work area, he will stand, stretch his legs, and walk around to the other side to begin shaping the opposite face. But that moment is still many strokes away. The blade continues to lift and descend, and you let your attention drift from the overall motion to the details of the timber's transformation. The spruce fiber is soft and even, with a grain so tight that the annual rings are difficult to separate by eye, and the adze cuts through the rings at an angle that varies as the carpenter works around the circumference works. When he cuts directly across the rings, the shavings come away in short, crumbly pieces that break apart before they reach the deck, and the sound shifts to a crisper note. When he cuts with the grain, moving the adze along the direction of the fibers, the shavings lengthen into ribbons that curl into perfect loops and maintain their shape until the cold makes them brittle enough to snap. The carpenter knows the difference without looking for it. His hands feel the resistance of the wood through the handle, and he adjusts his swing angle by instinct, keeping the cuts consistent despite the variation in grain direction. Now and then he encounters a knot, a place where a branch once grew from the trunk and left a hard swirling core of darker wood within the pale spruce. The adze blade bites differently into a knot, the sound turning from a hollow thunk to a denser, higher-pitched click, and the shaving comes away in small, hard fragments rather than long curls. The carpenter adjusts his technique in these spots, taking shorter strokes with a lower backswing, notching out the knot in a series of careful taps rather than peeling cuts. Once the knot is cut flush with the surrounding surface, he resumes his normal stroke, and the transition is so smooth that if you had looked away for a moment, you would not know the knot had been there at all. The cold works its own subtle changes on the adzing. The steel blade contracts slightly in the low temperature, making the metal even harder and more brittle at the edge, and the carpenter compensates by honing more frequently than he would in a milder climate. Every third pause or so he reaches into his tool roll and retrieves the whetstone, a small rectangular block of Arkansas stone that fits neatly into his palm. He uncorks the little oil bottle, lets a single drop fall onto the stone's surface, and then works the stone along the adze blade in small, tight circles. The motion is repetitive in its own way, the stone traveling from the heel of the blade to the tip and back again, each pass polishing the steel to a mirror sheen that gleams orange in the lantern light. The sound of honing is a soft, ringing shh that would be inaudible from any greater distance, but here, in the quiet of the deck, it reaches your ears as clearly as the adze strokes themselves. When the edge is restored, the carpenter wipes the blade with his rag, tucks the stone away, and resumes the swing. Your own body has settled into your spot on the folded sailcloth, and you find that your breathing has slowed to match the carpenter's rhythm without any conscious effort. The cold still rests on your cheeks and forehead, and you still feel it in the tips of your ears, but it has become a part of the background, no more demanding than the darkness itself. You realize that you could close your eyes and still see the carpenter in your mind, the arc of the adze imprinted on your inner vision by minutes or hours of watching. The sound alone would be enough to sustain the image, the thunk and whisper, the brush of shavings, the soft creak of his coat as he shifts his weight, the occasional distant bell from the watchstander forward. These sounds weave together into a fabric that has no seams, no beginning, and no end. The carpenter shifts his weight from his left knee to his right knee, a movement so small that only a careful observer would notice. His burlap pad compresses under the new pressure, and he settles into the adjusted position before resuming the strokes. The change is not a sign of discomfort, but of economy, a way of distributing the strain across different muscle groups so that no single joint grows tired. He has been doing this work for longer than you can calculate, and his body has learned to take care of itself in ways that his conscious mind does not direct. You think about the thousands of strokes that have come before this night, the masts shaped, the planks adzed, the deck beams fitted on ships that have long since sailed their last voyages, and the thought passes through your mind without leaving a trace. A series of 20 strokes passes, then a pause, then another series. The timber continues to round under the blade's patient work, the squared edges softening into curves, the flat planes giving way to a smooth cylinder that will someday slide through the mast partners and carry a sail high above the ice. The lanterns burn on, their flames perfectly steady for minutes at a time, interrupted only by the occasional flicker that comes from nowhere and goes nowhere. The frost on the shrouds grows a new layer of crystalline fuzz as the carpenter's breath condenses and settles on the rigging, and the ship's bell rings the hour with a dim bronze note that seems to come from underwater. The adze lifts and falls, and you let your thoughts dissolve into the simple, endless motion of the tool. The steel blade catching the light and then vanishing into shadow and then catching it again. A loop that has no urgency and no conclusion, only the quiet, steady shaping of wood in the deep, unbroken night. The spruce timber that rests across the wooden shocks has traveled a great distance to arrive at this particular spot on this particular deck, a journey measured not in miles alone, but in months of careful handling, in the slow growth of a forest that stood for a century before any axe touched its bark. Its story began on a mountainside far to the south, in a region where the summers are short but the days are long, and where the soil is thin and rocky enough to force the trees to grow slowly, building their wood cell by cell through decades of patient accumulation. A spruce that grows fast in rich bottomland will produce soft, wide-ringed timber that splinters under stress. But a spruce that fights for every inch of height on a stony slope builds a tightness into its fiber that makes it prized for spars and masts, capable of bending under load without breaking, capable of carrying canvas through gales that would snap a lesser stick. This timber came from such a tree, felled 2 summers ago by a logging crew who sawed it into a squared beam on the spot, then hauled it down to tidewater on a sled pulled by oxen whose breath plumed in air just as cold as the air on this Arctic deck, though in a different season and a different part of the world. After leaving the forest, the beam travelled by coastal schooner to a shipyard, where it was stacked in a seasoning shed open to the wind on all sides, its ends painted with tar to slow the drying and prevent splits. The seasoning took a full year, the wood slowly giving up its internal moisture until it was stable enough to work without warping. Then a purchasing agent bought it on behalf of the whaling company that owns this vessel, and the beam was loaded into the hold alongside barrels of salt meat and coils of rigging, carried across the equator and through the southern whaling grounds before the ship turned north for the Arctic summer. Now, with the whaling season long over and the ship frozen into a sea that has become a plain of ice, the timber has been brought up from the hold to serve its final purpose, to replace a topmast that carried away in a blow the previous autumn when the ship was still moving through open water and the crew could still imagine a return to home. You look at the beam as it lies bathed in the twin lanterns' glow, and the first thing you notice is the color. Spruce heartwood is not a single shade, but a range of tones that shift depending on how the light strikes the grain. In the direct center of the lantern pool, the wood glows a warm, pale honey color, almost amber, with the annual rings showing as faintly darker lines that trace parallel paths along the length of the beam. At the edges of the lit area, where the light fades into shadow, the color deepens into a richer brown, the same shade as a well-used saddle or an old leather-bound book. This variation is part of the wood's nature, not a flaw, but a signature, and the carpenter knows it well enough to predict how the finished mast will look once it is stepped and sanded and oiled against the weather. The grain of the spruce is the wood's most important quality, and you can see it now because the carpenter has worked enough of the surface to reveal the inner structure. The annual rings, each one marking a year of growth. A summer of long light and a winter of deep snow are packed together so tightly that you could place 10 of them under your thumbnail. There are places near the center of the beam where the rings become even tighter, a cluster of dark lines that record a sequence of cold years when the tree barely grew at all, and the carpenter notes these with a quiet respect because he knows that those slow-grown sections will be the strongest part of the spar. The rings sweep across the adze surface in subtle curves, following the original taper of the trunk, and in some spots they dip inward around the ghost of a knot, creating a pattern like the contour lines on a nautical chart. The grain is not perfectly straight. No spruce grain ever is, but it runs true enough for mast work, with only a slight spiral that the carpenter can compensate for when he steps the finished spar. Between the annual rings, visible only when you lean close and catch the light at a low angle, are the medullary rays, tiny silvery lines that radiate outward from the center of the tree, crossing the annual rings at right angles. These rays are a feature of spruce and other softwoods, and they give the wood a faint reflective quality, the subtle shimmer that moves across the surface as you shift your head. The carpenter can see them without leaning close. His eyes, trained by years of close work, register the shimmer as a sign of healthy wood, properly seasoned, ready to take the adze cuts without tearing. He sometimes pauses and tilts the timber slightly with the pry bar, catching the lantern light on a fresh-cut facet, checking the way the medullary rays flash in the glow, a quick, bright spark that confirms the wood's integrity. The surface that the adze has already shaped is smooth in a way that is particular to this tool. A plain surface is slick and glassy. A sanded surface is dull and soft. An adze surface falls between the two, covered in tiny, shallow facets that overlap like fish scales, each facet catching the light at a slightly different angle. Running a finger along the wood, and you have done this once. When the carpenter stepped away and you approached for a closer look, reveals a texture that is gently rippled, but not rough, like the surface of a fine piece of pottery before glazing. The adze blade has left no splinters behind because the cut follows the grain, rather than fighting it, and the tiny irregularities from one stroke to the next create a pattern that is as individual as a fingerprint. This mast will be unlike any other mast ever shaped, because no two adze surfaces are ever exactly the same. The carpenter is aware of the tiny crystals that form on the spruce as he works. The wood, though seasoned, still holds a trace of its original sap, a resinous substance that hardens into small amber-colored beads when exposed to the air. In this extreme cold, the sap freezes into a glassy state, and when the adze blade passes through a resin pocket, it releases a faint, sharp smell, a tang of turpentine that cuts through the cold air and then vanishes almost instantly. The frozen sap crystals glitter for a moment on the freshly cut surface before the carpenter brushes them away, tiny flecks of light that could be mistaken for ground glass. Some of the crystals cling to the adze blade itself, and every so often the carpenter wipes the steel clean with his rag, removing the sticky residue before it can build up and dull the cutting edge. The smell of the resin, when it comes, is the only hint of the forest that remains in this frozen seascape, a ghost of summer trapped inside the wood. The knots in the spruce tell their own quiet story. Each knot marks the place where a branch once grew, and the wood that formed around the branch created a hard, swirling pattern of compressed fibers that is both a challenge and a gift to the shipwright. A knot is denser than the surrounding wood, and it will dull a tool faster, which is why the carpenter shortens his strokes and uses a lighter touch when he encounters one. But a knot also adds strength, anchoring the grain in a way that prevents splits from running along the length of the timber. The carpenter reads each knot as he comes to it. A small, tight knot the size of a pea is nothing to worry about. A sound inclusion that will disappear under the final sanding. A larger knot, the width of a coin, requires a little more care, a little more patience, a recognition that the blade must be kept sharp to avoid tearing the dense fiber. He does not curse the knots or hurry past them. They are part of the wood, and he works them the same way he works everything else, with a steady, accepting rhythm. You watch as he pauses at one such knot, a dark oval about the size of a man's thumbprint, located near what will become the middle of the finished mast. The grain around the knot has formed a little wall, a swirl of fibers that loop around the inclusion like water around a stone. The carpenter runs a bare thumb over the knot, feeling the slight raise of the denser wood, and then he takes a series of very small, very controlled strokes that chip away at the edges until the knot is flush with the surface. The sound of these strokes is different, a quiet tapping rather than a peeling cut, and it takes perhaps 30 of these tiny strokes to fare the knot into the surrounding curve. When he is done, the knot remains as a small dark circle in the pale wood, a natural feature that will be barely visible once the mast is oiled and rigged, but that will always be there, a record of a branch that once stretched toward a sun that is now unimaginably distant. Beyond the knots, the spruce holds other small features that only a close observer would notice. There are tiny pitch pockets, flat cavities in the grain where sap accumulated during the tree's growth, now empty or filled with brittle, frozen resin. There are small checks, hairline cracks that form during the seasoning process, running a few inches along the grain and then stopping, harmless as long as they do not connect with a knot or reach the edge of the timber. The carpenter inspects each check as he uncovers it, measuring its depth with the corner of his chisel, and if the check is shallow, he simply works past it and trusts that the remaining wood will hold. If the check is deeper, he will mark it with a small charcoal dot, a note to himself that this section may need to be trimmed away or reinforced with a mast hoop later. There is no alarm in his inspection, only the same calm cataloguing of details that a mapmaker applies to a coastline. The lantern light plays across all these features in a way that changes constantly, though the lanterns themselves hang motionless in the still air. The flames are not perfectly steady. They breathe with a tiny, almost imperceptible pulse caused by the convection of hot air rising past the wick, and this pulse sends faint waves of brightness and shadow rippling across the timber's surface. The waves are too subtle to notice unless you stare at a single spot for a long time without blinking, but their cumulative effect is that the wood seems to have a slow life of its own, a gentle flicker of illumination that makes the grain appear to shift and flow. The shadows deepen in the tiny valleys between adze facets, and then brighten again, deepen and brighten, a cycle as slow as a sleeper's breathing. The cold affects the wood's appearance as well. The frost that settles on the unworked portions of the beam, the squared ends, that still carry the rough, dark surface from the sawmill, creates a thin white fuzz that sparkles under the lantern flames. This frost is not the thick rime that coats the rigging. It is a delicate bloom of crystals that forms when the carpenter's breath condenses on the cold surface and freezes immediately. As he works his way along the beam, the frost retreats from the newly added sections and reappears on the areas he has left untouched for more than a few minutes, a constantly moving boundary between cold and slightly less cold. The frost crystals are tiny hexagonal shapes that you can see only if you look very closely, and they melt instantly if touched by a warm finger, leaving a dark spot of moisture that freezes again in seconds. The carpenter pauses to trim the lantern wicks, a task that requires him to remove his right mitten entirely and work with bare hands for a full minute. He takes the wick snuffers from his tool roll, a small brass instrument like a pair of scissors with a box on one blade, and he reaches up to the first lantern, turning the wick down until the flame is low, then snipping away the charred upper portion of the wick with a precise, delicate motion. The snipped wick end falls into the brass box, and the carpenter turns the wick back up until the flame is the right height. He repeats this with the second lantern, and the whole operation takes perhaps 2 minutes, during which the deck grows perceptibly dimmer and then brighter again. The smell of the lamps, a mild oily scent that you have long since stopped noticing, strengthens briefly as the flames adjust to the fresh wick material and then settles back into the background. The timber itself, for all its quiet presence, is changing under the carpenter's hands. The square beam that was lifted from the hold is now almost entirely rounded along its upper half, the crisp corners planed away into gentle arcs. You can see the profile of the future mast beginning to emerge, a long taper that will slide through the mast partners and fit neatly into the step on the keelson. The thickest part of the mast, the section that will rest at deck level, is still a few inches too wide, and the carpenter has marked it with a charcoal line to remind himself of the final diameter. He checks this line frequently, measuring the width of the timber with the wooden calipers he keeps in his tool roll, a simple instrument made of 2 curved arms that pivot on a brass pin. The calipers are old, their wood dark with use, and the markings on the arms are worn faint, but the carpenter reads them without hesitation, squinting at the tiny numbers and nodding to himself before returning the calipers to their spot. The adze continues its steady motion, and the shavings continue to fall, piling up on the deck until the carpenter pauses to sweep them into the sack. The shavings from this section of the timber are slightly different in character from those that came before, because he is now working near the heart of the tree. The grain is tighter, and the shavings are thinner, almost translucent, curling into loops that hold their shape for a little while before the cold makes them snap. The carpenter picks up one such loop, a perfect spiral of pale wood, and examines it for a moment before tucking it into a crevice in the bulwark, adding it to a small collection of similar loops that he has saved for no reason you can discern. Perhaps he simply finds them beautiful, a small reward for hours of repetitive work. Perhaps they serve some future purpose that only he understands. You do not ask, and he does not explain. The night continues without any change in its deep, unbroken darkness. The ship's bell rings the half hour, and then the hour, and the carpenter works through both. his body swaying gently with the adze's arc. The timber glows under the lanterns, its grain shifting and shimmering, its resin pockets glittering, its knots peering out from the pale wood like dark eyes that hold no expression. The cold presses in from all sides, and the frost grows a little thicker on the unworked ends of the beam, and the pile of shavings in the canvas sack rises another inch. And still the adze lifts and falls, wifts and falls, while the spruce slowly takes the shape of a mast that will one day carry a sail above the ice fields under a sky that is not this endless night, but a clear, cold day with a sun that has finally returned to the world. The ship around you breathes in its own fashion, a slow respiration of wood and ice and cold air that has been going on since the moment the floes closed around the hull and will continue until the spring breakup sets the vessel free. You have learned to hear this breathing as a kind of companion to the carpenter's adze, a deeper and more irregular rhythm that underpins the steady stroke of steel on spruce. The sounds are not loud, not sudden, not the kind of noises that would startle a waking man. They are the settled, patient creaks and groans of a wooden structure under pressure, as natural as the ticking of a cooling stove or the rustle of leaves in a forest. To lie in your bunk at the beginning of the sleep period was to be cradled in these sounds, and now, sitting on your folded sailcloth near the carpenter's workspace, you let them flow around you without any need to name or catalogue them. The most constant of these sounds comes from the hull itself, where the ship's oak planks meet the ice. The ice is not a uniform solid, but a vast shifting jigsaw of floes that have frozen together, and though it appears motionless to the eye, it exerts a ceaseless pressure on the wooden walls that contain you. This pressure is not violent, it is not splinter timber or spring caulking, because the ship was built for exactly this environment. Its hull shaped in a way that encourages the ice to lift the vessel rather than crush it. The pressure expresses itself as a long, low creak that travels through the ship's frame from bow to stern, a sound so deep that you feel it in the soles of your boots before you hear it with your ears. The creak begins somewhere far forward, perhaps near the stem where the ice first meets the cutwater, and it rolls aft along the keel, passing through the keelson and up the floor timbers, arriving at your position on the deck as a faint vibration in the planks. The carpenter feels it too. You have seen him pause occasionally, his adze suspended in mid-air, while a particularly long creak makes its journey from one end of the ship to the other. He does not look up or show any concern, because the creak is a familiar voice, as routine as the cook's kettle coming to a boil. Alongside these deep, travelling groans there are sharper, more localized sounds that come from the ship's upper timbers. The deck planks, exposed to the full cold of the air, contract more than the warmer wood below, and the result is a series of small, crisp snaps that sound like twigs breaking under a distant foot. These snaps are unpredictable in their timing. Sometimes several minutes pass without a single one, and then 3 or 4 will occur in quick succession, a brief flurry of tiny reports that echo softly off the frozen sails and then fade. The carpenter's adzing sometimes masks these snaps, the thunk of the blade covering the fainter noise, but when the carpenter pauses to sweep shavings or hone his tool, you become aware of the deck's quiet conversation with the cold. Each snap represents a minuscule shift in the wood's fibers, a tiny adjustment as the plank settles into its frozen shape, and the cumulative effect over many hours is a slow settling that changes the ship's geometry by perhaps the thickness of a sheet of paper. The carpenter knows this, and he will check the mast partners and the shroud tensions before the new spar is stepped. But for now, the snaps are simply part of the night's music. The rigging, that complex web of standing and running lines that webs the masts and spars, has its own voice in the cold. The shrouds and stays, fashioned from hemp rope that was tarred in warmer latitudes, have frozen into rigid rods that stand away from the masts at unchanging angles. When the ship was still sailing, these lines hummed and sang in the wind, each shroud tuned to a different pitch by its tension and thickness. Now, with no wind to stir them, they are silent except for an occasional low vibration that occurs when the temperature drops another degree and the hemp fibers contract a little more. You hear this vibration as a faint, metallic-sounding thrum that seems to come from everywhere at once, a note so low that it borders on a feeling rather than a sound. Sometimes you mistake it for a distant voice or the rumble of a far-off icequake, but you have learned to recognize the note now, and it blends into the background as easily as the rest. The blocks and adze, those wooden fittings that guide and tension the running rigging, add their own small contributions. The lignum vitae sheaves inside the blocks, a wood so dense it sinks in water, contract at a different rate than the elm shells that house them, and the resulting friction can produce a short, high creak like a mouse's squeak. These little cries are rare, occurring only when the temperature shifts quickly enough to create a mismatch in the shrinkage rates, and they are so brief that you might dismiss them as imagination. The adze, with their 3 holes and their walnut color, grip the lanyards that hold the shrouds tight, and the lanyards themselves have frozen into curved shapes that remember the tension they carried when the ship last felt a wind load. All of these small pieces of hardware, arrayed in their hundreds across the vessel, are engaged in a slow, silent dialogue with the cold, and their tiny voices form a chorus so faint that only the long, still hours of the endless night make it audible. Forward, somewhere beyond the foremast and beneath the forecastle deck, the ship's bell hangs from a curved timber called the belfry. The bell is bronze-green in patches from decades of salt spray, and it is rung every half hour by the man who stands watch in the crow's nest. You have learned to listen for the bell without expecting it, letting the chime arrive as a gentle punctuation mark in the long sentence of the night. The watchman pulls the lanyard. The clapper strikes the bell's inner rim, and a single, round note unfolds into the darkness. 1 stroke for the first half hour, 2 strokes for the hour, then 1 for the next half hour, and so on through the cycle. The sound travels through the cold air with a clarity that surprises you every time, a pure, sweet tone that seems to hover for a long moment before it is absorbed by the ice and the dark. The bell's note is the only sound on the ship that feels intentional, the only one that is made by a human choice rather than by the impersonal work of temperature and pressure. The carpenter's adze is intentional too, of course, but the adze's rhythm is a constant presence, whereas the bell comes and goes, a brief reminder that somewhere on this ship another man is awake and watching. After the bell fades, the silence that follows is never quite complete. There is always something else to hear, if you attend closely enough. The galley stove, far aft and below, has its own small voice, even though the main cooking fire has been banked for hours. The stovepipe, a black iron column that rises through the deck and passes up through the cabin trunk, ticks and pings as it cools, the metal contracting in tiny arrhythmic beats that sound like a stone skipping across a frozen pond. The cook has left a pot of water on the stovetop, not for cooking, but to add a little moisture to the bone-dry air below decks, and the water evaporates slowly, producing a faint, nearly subliminal hiss that never quite resolves into a distinct sound, but adds a layer of white noise to the lower compartments. This hiss does not reach the deck where you sit, but you know it is there, and knowing it adds to your sense of the ship as a living place, a series of interlocking spaces, each with its own acoustic character. In the cable tier, the compartment deep in the bow where the anchor chains are stowed and the spare cordage is coiled, there is a sound that the crew has nicknamed the whisperer. It is not a voice, but a faint, dry rustle caused by the hemp ropes shifting against each other as they contract in the cold. The sound is so soft that you can only hear it when you are in the cable tier itself, and only then if you hold your breath and push your ear close to the coils. The cordage, much of it made from Russian hemp, that was tarred and wormed and parcelled and served with meticulous care, retains a slight flexibility even in the cold, and when one coil settles against another, it produces a papery, sliding sound that does indeed resemble a distant whisper. You have heard it once, during a task that took you forward to check the stoppers on the anchor cables, and the memory of it stays with you now, as you sit on deck, a ghost sound that your mind replays in the quiet moments between the carpenter's adze strokes. The carpenter's work continues through all of these sounds, the adze providing a steady foreground against which the ship's other voices play their intermittent parts. Thunk and slice. A deck plank snaps. Thunk and slice. The hull groans. Thunk and slice. The bell rings once from forward. The pattern is never quite the same from one minute to the next, but it is always recognizable, always predictable in its overall shape, like a well-known melody played with subtle variations by a patient musician. The carpenter himself seems to listen to the ship while he works, his head cocked slightly to one side, his hands continuing their motion while his ears attend to the deeper notes. He can tell the difference between a routine creak and one that might indicate a problem, a shifting butt block, a working tree nail, a plank beginning to spring from the frame, and he will stop his adzing and walk to the rail if he hears something that needs investigation. So far tonight he has heard nothing that gives him pause, and the adze continues its rhythm without interruption. The ice itself has a voice that travels for miles through the frozen sea. When a large floe cracks under pressure far away, the sound arrives at the ship as a deep, subterranean boom that seems to come from below rather than from any particular direction. These icequakes are infrequent, occurring perhaps once or twice in a watch, and they are the deepest sounds the Arctic produces, so low in pitch that they border on the tactile. You feel an ice quake in your chest before you hear it in your ears, a quick, dull pressure that passes through your body and then resolves into a rumble that rolls across the dark plain. The carpenter acknowledges these booms with a slight pause, a moment of stillness while the sound travels underneath the ship, and then he resumes work as though nothing has happened. The icequakes are not threats, they are simply the voice of the environment, the sound of a world that is always moving, even when it appears frozen solid. High above the deck, the lookout in the crow's nest adds an occasional human sound to the mix. He stamps his feet every 10 minutes or so to keep the blood moving in his toes, a muffled, rhythmic thumping that comes down through the mast as much as through the air. The crow's nest is a barrel-like structure mounted at the mainmast head, padded with canvas and lined with sheepskin, and the lookout is so bundled in furs that he resembles a shapeless lump rather than a man. He holds a speaking trumpet in case he needs to hail the deck, but he has not used it in weeks because there is nothing to see except darkness, and nothing to report except the cold and the quiet. His foot stamping is a comfort to you, a sign that another person is awake and enduring the same frozen watch that you are keeping, though his watch is official and yours is voluntary. The animals aboard the ship contribute their own small noises to the night's chorus. The hens, kept in a coop near the galley chimney, where the warmth is just enough to keep them alive, sometimes cluck softly in their sleep, dreaming perhaps of the farmyard they left behind in a port months ago. The ship's cat, a grey tum with a torn ear, moves through the lower decks on silent paws, but occasionally his presence is betrayed by a soft mew or the patter of his feet on a wooden stair. The pigs, 2 of them, penned aft near the stores, grunt and shuffle in their straw, their warm bodies creating small pockets of steam that condense on the overhead beams. These animal sounds are so ordinary, so domestic, that they create a strange contrast with the frozen wilderness outside the hull, a reminder that the ship carries a little piece of the living world with it wherever it goes. The air itself has a sound quality that changes with the temperature. On the coldest nights, the air becomes so clear that sounds carry farther and sharper than they do in warmer weather, and a whisper can be heard across the full length of the deck. The carpenter's adze, which would be a modest sound in a temperate latitude, rings out in this dense, cold air as though it were striking inside a cathedral, each stroke crisp and defined, with no blurring or echo. The edges of each sound are sharp, cut off cleanly by the cold, rather than fading gradually into silence. This acoustic clarity makes the night feel even emptier than it is, because when a sound does occur, it fills the emptiness completely for its brief duration, then vanishes into a stillness that seems all the deeper by contrast. You sit in your spot on the folded sailcloth, letting all of these sounds wash through you, without attempting to hold on to any one of them. The adze continues its steady pulse, the hull continues its slow creaking, the bell rings and the rigging hums and the ice booms in the distance. Together, the sounds create a tapestry that has no center and no edge, a weave of noise and silence that wraps around you as comfortably as the wool blankets in your bunk. You breathe in time with the carpenter's strokes, a slow, easy rhythm that requires no effort and no thought, and you feel the ship around you as a living presence, a wooden body with its own heartbeat, its own breath, its own voice, speaking quietly into the endless dark. The 2 lanterns that illuminate the carpenter's work hang from short lengths of tarred line secured to the mainmast stays, their tin bodies swaying with an almost imperceptible motion whenever the ship shifts against the ice. They are simple objects, built for function rather than beauty, yet in the deep darkness of the Arctic deck they have become the center of a small universe, the only source of light in a world that has forgotten what light looks like. Each lantern stands about 18 inches tall, a cylinder of tinplate rolled and soldered at the seam, with a reservoir at the base that holds the whale oil and a burner assembly at the top, where the wick draws fuel upward. A conical tin reflector, polished on its inner surface to a dull gleam, curves around the back half of the flame and directs the light forward in a concentrated pool, while a glass chimney protects the flame from drafts and magnifies its glow into a warm, steady sphere of yellow radiance that pushes back against the darkness for a radius of perhaps 12 feet before fading into shadow. The lantern on the left side of the workspace has a small dent in its reflector, a shallow depression about the size of a thumbprint that was made months ago when a block swung loose during a blow in the Bering Sea and struck the lantern before a crewman could catch the line. The dent has never been hammered out. The carpenter simply turned the lantern slightly so that the dent faces away from the work area and the light it casts remains unimpeded. But the imperfection creates a small, interesting effect that you have noticed during the long hours of watching, a tiny shadow, shaped vaguely like a crescent moon, that falls on the deck just to the left of the timber. The shadow does not move or change, and is become as familiar as a knot in a floorboard, a small landmark in the otherwise featureless pool of light. The second lantern is newer, or at least less marked, its tin still bright in places where the first has dulled to a soft pewter grey, and its reflector throws a slightly whiter light that blends with the first to create the even illumination the carpenter needs. The oil that feeds these flames comes from the ship's own stores, rendered from whales taken in the Southern Ocean more than a year ago. You know the history of this oil because you were part of the crew that processed it, and the memory of those weeks of flensing and boiling is so distant now that it feels like a story told to you by someone else. The whales' sperm whales, their great square heads full of the waxy spermaceti that makes the finest lamp oil, were taken in open water under a sun so hot that the deck planks grew warm enough to burn bare feet. The blubber was stripped in long twisting sheets, hoisted aboard with the cutting-in tackles and boiled in the try-works amidships, the great iron pots hissing and bubbling over brick furnaces, while the smoke rose into a sky that was bright and blue and endless. The oil that resulted from those boilings was cooled, strained through felt filters to remove any remaining solids, and barreled into oaken casks that were lowered into the hold and stacked in dark rows. Some of those barrels were destined for sale in port, to be burned in lamps in houses and streets and lighthouses all over the world, but some were kept for the ship's own use. And it is this oil, drawn from one of the last barrels still unbroached, that now burns steadily in the two lanterns above the carpenter's head. The quality of whale oil as a lamp fuel is something you have come to appreciate during the long Arctic night, when the only alternative would be darkness absolute and complete. Spermaceti oil, when properly rendered and strained, burns with a flame that is bright enough to read by, yellow-white rather than smoky orange, and it produces almost no odor when the wick is trimmed correctly. It is thin enough to climb the wick without clogging the fibers, but thick enough that it does not evaporate quickly from the reservoir, and a single filling of the lantern base will last through an entire watch and into the next. The flame it produces is steady in still air, with only the faintest pulse caused by the convection of heated vapor rising past the glass chimney, and this steadiness is what makes the carpenter's precise work possible. A flame that flickered or smoked would cast moving shadows that could confuse the eye and cause a misstroke of the adze. But these lanterns, burning their pure spermaceti, have never once faltered in all the hours you have watched them. The carpenter tends the lanterns as part of his routine, a task so ingrained that he performs it without breaking the rhythm of his work for more than a few minutes. Every hour, or perhaps every 90 minutes, you have never timed it exactly. He sets down the adze, straightens his back, and reaches for the wick snuffers that rest in a loop of canvas sewn to his tool roll. The snuffers are a small brass instrument shaped like a pair of scissors, but with a small rectangular box attached to one blade, and their purpose is to trim away the charred upper end of the wick without extinguishing the flame. A wick that is allowed to burn without trimming will develop a knob of carbon at its tip, a tiny mushroom of black soot that causes the flame to smoke and dim, wasting oil and reducing the light. Trimming removes this carbon cleanly, restoring the flame to its proper shape. You watch as the carpenter removes his right mitten and stands slowly, his knees cracking softly as he straightens to his full height for the first time in what may be 2 hours. He reaches up to the first lantern, his bare fingers moving with the delicacy of a surgeon, despite the cold that must be biting into his skin. He turns the little brass knob on the side of the burner, lowering the wick until the flame is small and blue, barely a spark. Then he fits the snuffers around the wick tube and snips, a quick, precise motion that severs the charred tip. The carbon falls into the brass box on the snuffer blade, and the carpenter withdraws the tool, turns the wick back up, and watches for a moment as the flame re-establishes itself, growing from blue to yellow to white as it finds its proper height. He repeats the process with the second lantern, and when both flames are burning steadily again, he empties the brass box of the snuffers into a small tin that he keeps for the purpose, its lid screwed on tight to prevent any soot from drifting onto the clean wood of the workspace. The whole operation takes perhaps 2 minutes, during which the deck grows perceptibly dimmer and then brighter again, and the smell of the trimmed wicks, a faint, clean scent of burning cotton, drifts past your face and vanishes. The reservoirs of the lanterns must be refilled periodically, and this is a task that falls to the carpenter as well, though it happens less frequently than the wick trimming. A small copper funnel with a narrow spout hangs from a hook on the bulwark near the workspace, wrapped in a scrap of canvas to protect it from frost, and a stoppered stoneware jug of lamp oil rests in a wooden rack built specifically to hold it upright on the rolling deck, a feature that is now unnecessary given the ship's frozen state. But that speaks to the forethought of the ship's joiner. When the oil level in a lantern drops to within a finger's width of the bottom, the carpenter pauses his adzing, unstoppers the jug, and pours carefully through the funnel, filling the reservoir to just below the brim. The oil glugs softly as it leaves the jug, a sound that seems unnaturally loud in the quiet of the deck, and the surface of the fresh oil in the reservoir catches the flame above it and reflects it back as a tiny, wavering twin, a second flame that dances upside down in the amber liquid. The pour takes only a few seconds, and then the jug is restoppered, the funnel is wiped clean with a rag and hung back on its hook, and the light continues as before, steady and unchanging. You shift on your folded sailcloth and consider the oil that is burning away, drop by drop, in those 2 lanterns. The barrel from which the stoneware jug was filled is one of the last in the hold. You know this because the cooper mentioned it during a meal some days ago, noting that there were perhaps 3 barrels of lamp oil remaining, and that if the ice did not break before the oil ran out, the crew would have to fall back on candles made from tallow, which smoked and stank and gave barely enough light to see a hand in front of a face. But the carpenter does not seem concerned about this dwindling supply. He uses the oil as he uses the adze, steadily, without waste, trusting that what is needed will last as long as it is needed. There is a kind of faith in this, a quiet belief that the world is ordered well enough that a man who does his work with care will not be left in the dark before the work is done. Whether this faith is justified is a question for another time, and you do not ask it of yourself. The light that the lanterns produce is not uniform. It has a texture, a character that changes depending on where you sit and how you look at it. Directly beneath the lanterns where the carpenter works, the light is bright and clean, a warm yellow-white that reveals every detail of the spruce grain and the adze facets. At the edges of the pool, where the illumination begins to fade, the light takes on a softer quality, a gentle amber that blurs the outlines of objects and makes the darkness beyond seem deeper by contrast. If you turn your head and look at the lanterns from the corner of your eye, the flames appear slightly larger than they really are, surrounded by a faint halo that is an illusion of your own vision, adapting to the dark. The frost on the deck catches the light in 1,000 tiny glints, each crystal acting as a microscopic mirror, so that the floor of the workspace seems dusted with something finer than snow, a powder of captured stars that shifts and twinkles as the flames breathe. The lanterns also cast shadows, and these shadows are as much a part of the scene as the light itself. The carpenter's body throws a long, dark shape that stretches across the deck to the port bulwark, its outline softened by the fact that the light comes from 2 sources rather than 1, creating a penumbra where the shadow is not quite black. The adze, when it rises above his shoulder, casts a brief sharp shadow on the deck planks, a dark crescent that appears and disappears with each stroke. The timber rests in a zone of brightness, but its far end, the squared section that has not yet been shaped, fades into a dim twilight where the grain is barely visible and the frost crust glows with a faint, phosphorescent quality. Even you, sitting outside the main pool of light, are visible to the carpenter as a dark shape against the bulwark, your face lit faintly on one side by the ambient glow, your breath pluming in the cold air like smoke from a pipe. There is a particular quality to whale oil lamplight that you have never seen in any other form of illumination, a kind of living warmth that electric light and gaslight do not possess. The flame of a spermaceti lamp is not blue at its base and yellow at its tip like a candle flame. It is white throughout, with only a tiny blue cup at the very bottom where the wick meets the burner, and it burns with a steadiness that seems almost conscious, as if the lamp were a quiet animal that had chosen to share its light with the humans around it. The color of objects under this light is slightly different from their color under the sun. The spruce wood looks richer, more golden. The carpenter's skin takes on a ruddy tone. The frost on the deck appears warm rather than cold. A carpet of tiny gold coins rather than frozen water. This transformation is an illusion, of course, a trick of the spectrum, but it has the effect of making the workspace feel sheltered and safe. A small pocket of warmth and life in the vast, frozen dark. The lanterns have been burning for so many hours now, so many watches, that their bodies have grown warm to the touch, and the frost does not settle on their tin surfaces the way it settles on every other object on deck. You noticed this once, when you stood to stretch your legs and passed close to the main mast stay. The lanterns radiate a faint heat that you could feel on your cheek from a distance of 6 inches, a ghost of warmth that vanished as soon as you moved away. This heat is not wasted. It rises upward through the glass chimney and melts the frost on the rigging directly above the lanterns, so that a single thin strand of clean, dark line hangs in the midst of the white-shrouded stays, a thread of normalcy in a world of ice. The carpenter sometimes holds his hands near the lantern glass between strokes, not close enough to risk scorching his mittens, but close enough to borrow a little warmth for his stiff fingers before returning to the adze. The oil that makes all this possible has a smell, though it is so faint that you have to concentrate to detect it. It is not the greasy, fishy smell that people sometimes associate with whale products. That smell comes from the lower grades of oil, the brown oil rendered from humpback or bowhead blubber, which is used for lubrication and leather treatment rather than for light. Spermaceti oil, when pure, has a scent that is clean and almost sweet, faintly waxy, with a hint of something floral that you could never quite identify. The smell hangs in the lantern area as a soft background note, never intrusive, barely present, but always there when you think to notice it. Some of the crew say it reminds them of beeswax candles in a church, though you have not been in a church for many years and cannot confirm the comparison. The wicks themselves, the humble carriers of the fuel, are made of cotton that was spun and braided in a mill somewhere in New England, shipped across the world in a bale, and cut to length by the ship's lamp trimmer duty that the carpenter has absorbed now that the crew has been reduced to a winter skeleton. The wicks are flat, not round, because a flat wick presents more surface area to the air and produces a brighter, cleaner flame. They are stored in a small tin box lined with paper, kept in the carpenter's tool roll to protect them from damp, and each wick will last for many hours of burning before it needs to be replaced entirely. When a wick is finally too short to draw oil properly, the carpenter removes it with tweezers, drops it into the soot tin, and threads a fresh wick through the burner tube, with a patience that is remarkable given how difficult it is to thread a limp piece of cotton through a narrow brass tube in the cold and the dark. But he manages, as he manages everything else, with the same steady, unhurried precision. The lantern glass must be cleaned occasionally, because even the purest spermaceti oil leaves a faint film of soot on the inside of the chimney over many hours of burning. The carpenter removes the glass chimney carefully, holding it between his mittened palms, and polishes it with a soft rag that he keeps specifically for this purpose. The glass is thin and fragile, and in this cold it is even more brittle than usual, so he handles it with the same gentleness he would use on a bird's egg. The cleaning takes only moments, and when the chimney is replaced the flame inside seems brighter than before, as though a veil has been lifted from the world. You sit on your sailcloth and watch the lamplight dance on the carpenter's moving hands, and you think about the journey the light has taken to reach this frozen deck. The whales that gave the oil swam in warm seas under a tropical sun, diving into depths no human could reach. their great tails pushing them through water that was blue as ink. The men who hunted them worked in the glare and the heat, risking their lives for the barrels of oil that would keep lamps burning a year later and half a world away. The try-works that rendered the blubber glowed red through the night watches of a southern autumn, and the smoke that rose from the boiling pots carried the scent of the ocean back to the ocean. And now the oil that survived that long chain of labor and luck is burning here, in the endless night of the Arctic, while a single quiet man shapes a mast from a spruce log and the sound of the adze echoes across the frozen sea. The lanterns will burn through this watch and into the next, their oil levels dropping with the slow patience of water wearing away stone. The carpenter will trim the wicks again in an hour, and then perhaps one more time before his hands grow too tired to hold the adze and he retreats to his own bunk. The light they cast will hold the darkness at bay for as long as the oil lasts, and when the oil is gone there will be more, because there is always more, somewhere in the hold or somewhere in the world. For now, in this moment, the two flames burn steadily and silently, their glow pooling on the deck and warming the spruce and the frost and the carpenter's moving hands, while the endless night beyond the light remains as dark and patient as the sea that lies frozen beneath the hull. The companionway hatch that leads below to the galley is located aft of the mainmast, a dark square opening in the deck covered by a sliding wooden door that the cook must push aside with his shoulder when he carries a laden tray up the steep ladder. You do not hear him coming until the door scrapes against its frozen runners, a sound that cuts through the adze's rhythm with a dry wooden rasp, and then a dim yellow glow appears in the hatchway as the cook ascends from the warmth below. The glow grows brighter as he climbs, illuminating the steam that rises from the kettle he carries, and then his head and shoulders emerge into the deck-level cold, his face reddened by the galley fire and his breath pluming in thick clouds that mingle with the kettle's steam. The carpenter hears the hatch door scrape, and he finishes the stroke he is on, then rests the adze across the timber in a position that will not dull the blade, and straightens his back by slow degrees until he is sitting on his heels with his hands resting on his thighs. The cook is a man of few words and steady habits. At his arrival on deck at the midpoint of the night watch is as predictable as the bell. He wears a long canvas apron over his wool coat, the apron stained with grease and flour and the dark marks of charcoal from the stove, and he has wrapped a towel around his neck to catch the drips of condensation that fall from his beard when he moves between the warm galley and the cold deck. The kettle he carries is made of heavy iron, blackened by years of sitting on the stovetop, and its lid rattles softly with the vibration of his footsteps as he crosses the deck. In his other hand he carries a wooden tray that holds 2 tin mugs, a small crock of tea leaves, a lump of hard sugar wrapped in a cloth, and a long-handled spoon. The tray is scarred and dark with use, its edges smoothed by countless handlings, and it has a raised rim that keeps the mugs from sliding off when the ship rolls, though there has been no rolling for many weeks now, and the rim serves no purpose except as a reminder of other seas. The cook sets the tray down on a clear spot near the carpenter's tool roll, the wood of the tray meeting the deck plank with a soft, solid clunk. He hooks the kettle handle over an iron ring that hangs from a stay above the workspace, a ring that was put there long ago for exactly this purpose, so that the kettle can hang without scalding anyone or tipping over. The steam from the kettle spout rises in a thick column that bends and dissipates in the cold air, vanishing into the darkness above the lanterns. The cook nods to the carpenter, a brief dip of his chin that says all that needs to be said, and the carpenter nods back, and then the cook turns to you and nods as well, because you are part of this small ritual and have been for as long as the mid-watch tea has been served. You rise from your sailcloth seat and cross the few steps to the workspace, your legs stiff from sitting still and your boots making their soft, dry crunch on the layer of frost. The warmth of the kettle reaches you before you arrive, a faint sensation on your cheeks that is gone almost as soon as you feel it, but that reminds you what heat feels like. The cook opens the small crock of tea leaves and measures a spoonful into each tin mug, the dry leaves rustling like paper as they fall, and then he lifts the kettle from its ring and pours hot water over the leaves. The water is not boiling. The galley stove does not produce a true boil in this cold, and the walk from the galley to the deck has cooled it further, but it is hot enough to release the fragrance of the tea, a dark, earthy smell that rises with the steam and fills the lantern-lit workspace. The tea itself is a coarse black variety, the kind that comes pressed into bricks and wrapped in paper, printed with characters you cannot read, traded from port to port across the whole expanse of the Pacific until it found its way into the ship's stores. It has been in the hold for a long time, and it tastes faintly of the wood of the chest that holds it. But it is hot, and it is wet, and it is the only luxury the night watch has to look forward to. The cook wraps the lump of hard sugar in a corner of the cloth and taps it with the handle of the spoon, breaking off a few small crystals that he drops into each mug. The sugar is a pale brown, unrefined, and it dissolves slowly in the tea, leaving a faint sweetness that barely registers on the tongue, but that the body welcomes nonetheless. He stirs each mug with the long-handled spoon, the metal clinking softly against the tin sides, and then he hands one mug to the carpenter and one to you. The carpenter takes his mug in both hands, the cut-off fingers of his mittens allowing his bare fingertips to feel the warmth of the tin, and he holds it close to his face for a moment, letting the steam bathe his cheeks before he takes the first sip. You do the same, wrapping your mittened hands around the hot tin and feeling the warmth seep through the wool to your palms. A sensation so pleasant that you close your eyes for a moment to appreciate it fully. The tea is weak, as it always is when made from leaves that have been steeped and dried and stored and steeped again over many months. But the taste is not the point. The point is the warmth, the brief reprieve from the constant cold, the feeling of hot liquid traveling down your throat and settling in your stomach, where it spreads a small glowing circle of heat that radiates outward to your chest and your limbs. You take small sips, making the tea last, because the mugs are not large and the kettle is already cooling, and there will be no second pour until the next mid-watch, many hours from now. The carpenter drinks his tea the same way, slowly, deliberately, his eyes half closed as he savors the heat. He does not speak, neither do you. Neither does the cook, who stands with his arms crossed inside his apron, waiting to collect the empty mugs and return to the galley. The silence during the tea pause is different from the silence of the adzing. Then there was sound to fill the space, the steady thunk and slice that gave shape to the quiet. Now, with the adze resting motionless across the timber and the lanterns burning steadily overhead, the quiet is deeper and more complete. The ship's sounds reassert themselves in the absence of the carpenter's rhythm, a long creak from the hull, a snap from a deck plank, the distant stamp of the lookout's feet high in the crow's nest. The steam from the mugs rises in twin columns that twine together and disappear, and the cold creeps back toward your face and your fingers even as the tea warms your core. This contrast, the heat inside and the cold outside, is a familiar sensation, one you have experienced thousands of times in your life at sea, and it never loses its small power to comfort. After a minute or two, the cook breaks the silence with a quiet word, something about the bread he has set to rise near the stovepipe, and whether the carpenter will want a piece when it is baked. The carpenter answers in a low rumble, his voice rusty from disuse, saying that he will take whatever is offered and be grateful for it. The cook nods, and then he asks about the timber, whether the grain is running true at the knot he noticed earlier. The carpenter takes another sip of tea and considers the question, turning to look at the adze surface of the spruce as though seeing it for the first time. The grain is fine, he says, the knot is small and tight and will cause no trouble when the mast is stepped. The cook accepts this assessment with another nod, and the conversation, such as it was, subsides back into the quiet. These are the only words spoken during the tea pause, and they are enough. The carpenter does not need to talk, and neither do you, and neither does the cook. The ritual of the tea is not about conversation, it is about presence, about the acknowledgement that the three of you are awake in the endless night while the rest of the crew sleeps, about the shared experience of warmth and cold and the taste of weak tea on a frozen deck. The tea pause has been part of the ship's routine since the ice closed in, and it will continue until the ice breaks. A small fixed point in the formless dark that gives shape to the watches. The carpenter drains the last of his tea and hands the empty mug back to the cook, the tin now lukewarm and streaked with a dark residue of leaves at the bottom. The cook takes the mug and looks at you, and you finish your own tea in a final swallow. The last drop's cooler than the first, but still warm enough to be pleasant. You hand over your mug, and the cook sets both mugs on the wooden tray, tucks the crock of tea leaves and the sugar cloth beside them, and lifts the kettle from its hanging ring by the handle, which has cooled enough to be touched without a mitt. He turns and crosses the deck toward the companionway hatch, his footsteps slow and careful on the frost, the tray balanced in one hand and the kettle in the other. The lantern light follows him for a few steps and then releases him into the shadow, and you hear the scrape of the hatch door as he pushes it aside, the soft thump of his boots on the ladder rungs, and then the faint, distant clank of the kettle being set back on the galley stove. The hatch door slides shut with a muffled thud, and the deck returns to its previous state. The two lanterns, the timber, the frost, and the carpenter preparing to resume his work. The carpenter does not rise immediately from his kneeling position. He stays where he is for a little while longer, his hands resting on his thighs, his breath slowing after the small exertion of drinking. The tea pause has given his body a chance to register its fatigue, and you can see in the slight droop of his shoulders that the hours of adzing have taken their toll. But he does not complain, and he does not linger. After perhaps 30 seconds of stillness, he shifts his weight, settles his knees more firmly on the burlap pad, and reaches for the adze. His hands find the grip by memory, the left near the blade and the right at the butt, and he lifts the tool from its resting place across the timber. He takes a moment to sight along the edge, checking that the blade has not picked up any nicks during the work before the pause, and then he leans forward from his hips and resumes the rhythm. The first stroke after the pause lands exactly where the last stroke before the pause would have landed, a seamless continuation that erases the break as though it had never happened. Thunk and slice, pause, thunk and slice. The sound is the same as before, the motion is the same, the pace is the same, but something has changed in the atmosphere, a subtle softening of the night's austerity. The tea has done its work. The carpenter's movements are perhaps a fraction more fluid, his breathing a fraction deeper, the warmth in his stomach translating into a slight loosening of the muscles in his back and shoulders. You feel the same effect in your own body as you return to your sailcloth seat and settle against the bulwark. The cold is still present, the darkness is still absolute, but the tea has placed a small barrier between you and the full weight of the night, a thin, warm shield that will last for another hour or so before it fades. You watch the adze rise and fall, and you think about the cook now back in the galley, tending his bread dough and his stove, his own small world of warmth and yeast and fire that exists parallel to the carpenter's world of wood and steel and cold. The galley is a different kind of workshop, but its rhythms are the same. The kneading of dough, the stoking of the fire, the wiping of the counters, all performed with the same steady, unhurried patience that governs the adzing on deck. The cook will produce his bread, the carpenter will produce his mast, and both will be the result of many small, repeated actions accumulated over time. The ship is full of such rhythms, you realize, each crewman engaged in a quiet, repetitive labor that sustains the whole. Even you, sitting here and watching, are part of the pattern, your presence providing a silent audience that somehow makes the carpenter's solitary work feel less solitary. The tea has left a faint aftertaste in your mouth, a slightly bitter, woody flavor that lingers on the back of your tongue. You do not mind it. It is a reminder of the warmth that has passed, a sensory echo that will persist until the cold numbs your palate and the taste fades. You run your tongue over your teeth and taste the faint sweetness of the sugar, the slight grit of tea dust that escaped the crock, and then you swallow and let the taste go. The mug, now back in the galley, will be rinsed and dried and placed on a shelf to wait for the next mid-watch, when the cook will fill it again and carry it up the ladder, and the small ritual will repeat, and the carpenter will pause his adzing, and you will rise from your sailcloth, and the tea will steam in the cold air, and the night will continue, exactly as it has and exactly as it will. The canvas sack that holds the shavings stands at the edge of the carpenter's workspace, its mouth held open by a wire hoop stitched into the hem, its sides bulging outward in soft, irregular folds that speak of the many handfuls of wood it has already received. The sack is made from the same heavy canvas as the ship's sails, a fabric that was woven in a mill far to the south and brought aboard as spare cloth, then cut and sewn into this utilitarian shape by the sailmaker during a quiet watch last summer. The stitching around the hoop is done with wax twine in a neat, even pattern, each stitch the same length as the one before it, a reminder that the sailmaker's work is as precise in its own way as the carpenter's. The sack stands perhaps 2 feet high when empty and collapses into a shapeless heap when full, and right now it is nearly 3/4 full. The shavings pressing against its sides with the light, springy pressure of a material that is mostly air. The shavings themselves are the byproduct of every stroke the carpenter has made since he began shaping this timber, the removed material that must be cleared away so that the mast can emerge from the squared beam. They are not waste in the ordinary sense, not something to be thrown overboard or discarded carelessly, because on a ship frozen into the Arctic ice, the concept of waste does not exist in the same way it might in a port city with markets and supply ships and unlimited woodlots. Here, every scrap of material has value. Every piece of wood, every drop of oil, every strand of rope fiber must serve a purpose or be saved until a purpose presents itself. The shavings are no exception, and as you watch the carpenter pause to sweep another armful into the sack, you begin to understand the quiet economy that governs this small, frozen world. The most immediate use of the shavings, the one that will consume the bulk of what the carpenter produces tonight, is as fuel for the galley stove. The cook burns them to bring his kettles to a boil and to keep the bread oven at the right temperature, mixing the dry spruce curls with the coal that is carefully rationed from the bunkers. The shavings catch fire easily, their thin edges curling and blackening at the first touch of a flame, and they burn hot and fast, providing the quick heat needed to raise steam or to warm a pot of soup for the watch change. The cook stores them in a wooden bin beside the stove, a bin that the carpenter's sweepings have kept filled day after day. And when the bin runs low, the cook sends word forward and the carpenter sends back a full sack. The shavings are preferred over coal for some tasks because they produce no heavy smoke, and because their flame is a bright, cheerful yellow that lights the galley almost as well as a lamp. You have seen this process in action, the journey of a shaving from the adze blade to the fire. The carpenter fills the sack, ties the drawstring tight, and leaves it beside the main hatch for the cook to collect. The cook, or sometimes one of the watchstanders whose duties are light, carries the sack down the companionway ladder and into the galley, where the warmth of the stove makes the shavings curl a little tighter and release a faint, sweet smell of heated resin. The cook unties the drawstring, scoops a handful of shavings into the firebox, and the flames leap up immediately, the thin wood vanishing into heat and light in a matter of seconds. The ash that remains is fine and white and falls through the grate into the ash pan below, where it will later be collected and scattered on the deck to provide traction on the frost. Nothing is wasted. The shavings become fire, the fire becomes warmth, the warmth becomes hot water and baked bread and a few hours of comfort in the cold. But the galley stove is not the only destination for the carpenter's shavings. Some are set aside for a different purpose, one that serves the crew's comfort rather than their sustenance. The sleeping quarters on a whaler are cold, even with the thick blankets and the shared body heat of multiple men in a small space, and the deck planks beneath the mattresses can draw warmth away faster than the body can produce it. To combat this, the crew place a layer of wood shavings between the deck and their straw mattresses, creating a barrier of trapped air that insulates them from the frozen timber below. The shavings used for this purpose are carefully selected, the driest, cleanest curls, free of resin pockets that might stick to the canvas tick, long enough to form a springy mat, but not so long that they will wad up and lose their loft. The carpenter sets these choice shavings aside in a separate sack, a smaller one made of lighter canvas, and when a crewman needs to freshen his bunk, he comes aft with a bucket and scoops out what he needs. You have done this yourself not many days ago, when the cold seemed to be seeping through your mattress with particular determination. You unrolled your blankets, lifted the straw tick from the deck, and spread a layer of spruce shavings across the planks, smoothing them flat with your hands until the layer was even and perhaps 3 inches thick. The shavings rustled softly under your touch, a dry, papery sound that was pleasant in its own quiet way, and the smell of spruce rose around you, faint but clean, like walking through a forest on a cold morning. When you replaced the mattress and lay down, the difference was immediate. The cold no longer pressed against your back, and the shavings seemed to mold themselves to the shape of your body, creating a cradle that was both soft and supportive. You slept deeply that watch, and when you woke, the shavings had compressed to half their thickness, the air pockets that had provided the insulation collapsed by your weight. In a few days, you will need to replace them, and the carpenter will have more shavings ready. Another use for the shavings, less common but equally practical, is as packing material for the ship's seams. A wooden ship in the Arctic ice takes a beating from the pressure of the floes, and though the hull of this vessel was built with double-sawn frames and extra thick planking, small leaks do develop over time. When water seeps through a seam, the carpenter or the boatswain packs the gap with oakum of fibrous material made from old rope that has been untwisted and picked apart, and then seals it with pitch. But oakum is not always the best material for every leak, especially when the leak is small and the water is seeping rather than gushing. In these cases, a wad of spruce shavings packed tight into the seam with a caulking iron can swell when it gets wet and fill the gap just as effectively. The carpenter keeps a small bundle of selected shavings in his tool roll for exactly this eventuality. Long, straight curls with no knots or resinous patches, selected because they will swell evenly and not tear under the caulking iron. The shavings also serve as a kind of currency on the ship, a trade good that passes between the different departments. The cooper needs shavings to pack around his barrel staves when he's bending them into shape, because the steam from the hot water he uses will soften the spruce and make the packing more pliable. The boatswain needs shavings to wipe excess tar from his serving mallet when he's worming and parcelling a new line. The gunner needs shavings to clean the bores of the harpoon guns after they've been fired, because the dry spruce absorbs the powder residue without scratching the steel. Anyone on the ship who needs a handful of shavings knows to come to the carpenter, and the carpenter always has a sack ready, and the transaction is carried out with a nod or a quiet word, never with any sense of debt or obligation. The shavings have different characters depending on how they were produced, and the carpenter sorts them accordingly without seeming to think about it. The coarse shavings, the ones that come from the heavy roughing out work with the large adze, are thick and somewhat brittle, curling in tight spirals that snap easily when bent. These are best suited for the galley stove, because they burn longer than the fine shavings and produce more heat relative to their bulk. The fine shavings, the ones that come from the finishing adze and the draw knife, are thin as paper and translucent, so light that they float on the air currents and must be gathered carefully into the sack before they scatter. These are best for the bunks, because their fine texture creates more air pockets and therefore better insulation. The shavings that come from the knots are different still. Short, crumbling pieces that are dense with resin and burn with a hot, smoky flame that is not ideal for the galley, but can be useful for starting a fire quickly under difficult conditions. The carpenter keeps the knot shavings in a small tin box separate from the main sack, and the cook knows to ask for them only when he needs a particularly fierce fire. The sack that holds the shavings develops its own small history over the course of the night. At the beginning of the watch it was nearly empty, the canvas limp and folded over on itself, the wire hoop a perfect circle with no pressure from within. As the carpenter adzed his way along the timber, the sack slowly filled, the shavings rising in layers that recorded the progression of the work, a stratum of thick curls from the roughing cuts at the bottom, a layer of finer shavings from the shaping work in the middle, and the fresh accumulation of finishing curls on top. The carpenter pauses every few minutes to sweep the deck and feed the new shavings into the sack, and each time he does this, he pats the contents down with the flat of his hand, compressing the airy mass so that the sack will hold more. The sack is a record of the night's labor, a tangible measurement of progress that grows with every stroke of the adze. Among the shavings, the carpenter occasionally finds a curl that is perfect, a long, unbroken spiral of pale spruce that springs away from the adze in one continuous piece, its thickness uniform from end to end, its edges clean and sharp, its color a uniform honey gold. These perfect curls are rare, because the adze is not a tool designed for making curls. It is designed for removing wood, and the shavings it produces are usually shorter and more irregular. But every now and then the grain aligns just right. The blade catches the fibers at just the right angle, and a curl emerges that seems almost intentional, almost crafted. The carpenter sets these aside on a small ledge near the bulwark, arranging them in a row that grows over the course of the night. You have watched this small collection accumulate, and you have wondered what the carpenter will do with them. Perhaps he will give them to a crewman as a gift, a small piece of beauty in a world that has little use for beauty. Perhaps he will keep them himself, a private record of the best cuts he has made. Perhaps he will simply sweep them into the sack at the end of the watch, returning them to the practical economy of the ship. You do not ask, and he does not explain, and the curls continue to accumulate on their ledge. The smell of the shavings changes subtly as the night goes on, a variation that only someone sitting as still and watching as closely as you are would notice. When the carpenter first opens a fresh section of the timber, the shavings release a burst of trapped scent, the concentrated fragrance of spruce resin that has been sealed inside the wood for the months since it was milled. This scent is sharp and clean, almost medicinal, with a hint of something sweet underneath. As the shavings sit in the cold air, exposed to the moving currents that circulate around the deck, the scent fades gradually, the volatile oils evaporating into the darkness until the shavings smell only faintly of wood, a dried, dusty odor that is barely distinguishable from the general smell of the ship. The shavings that go to the galley release their scent all at once when they hit the fire, a sudden burst of fragrance that fills the lower decks for a few seconds before the ventilation carries it away. The canvas sack itself is wearing out, you notice, the fabric near the seams beginning to fray from the friction of being dragged across the deck and the weight of its contents. The sailmaker will need to patch it soon, or sew a new one from the spare canvas in the forepeak, but for now it holds together well enough, and the carpenter treats it with the same care he treats his other tools, folding it neatly when it is empty and storing it in a dry corner of his workshop space below decks. The sack has been with the ship for several seasons, and it has held shavings of oak and ash and elm in addition to the spruce that fills it now, a succession of different woods and different projects, each one leaving its own faint trace in the fibers of the canvas. The shavings that are not needed for any immediate purpose are stored in the hold, packed into empty barrels that once held salt pork or flour, the barrels labelled with a chalk mark that says "Wood Wool" in the boatswain's neat printing. These barrels will be opened when the ship is underway again, when the galley stove needs more fuel than the daily adzing can provide, or when a new leak develops and needs to be packed. The stored shavings are perfectly dry because the hold is cold enough to freeze any moisture that might otherwise cause mold, and they will keep indefinitely in these conditions, a bank of stored warmth and utility that the crew can draw upon as needed. You watch the carpenter sweep another armful of shavings into the sack, the curls tumbling over each other in the lantern light, and you think about the journey that these small pieces of spruce have taken. They were once part of a living tree, growing on a mountainside, drawing water from the soil and carbon from the air, building their fibers cell by cell through the long summers and the dark winters. The tree fell, the log was milled, the beam was seasoned and shipped and stored, and finally brought up to the deck to be shaped into a mast. The shavings are the parts of the tree that will not become the mast, the excess wood that the carpenter removes to reveal the form hidden inside the square beam, and yet they are not discarded, not wasted, but gathered and saved and put to use in a dozen small ways that sustain the life of the ship. The shavings will warm the cook's hands over the galley stove, cushion the sleep of the tired crew, plug the leaks that the ice opens in the hull, clean the tools that keep the ship functional. They are the quiet, unnoticed foundation upon which the visible work rests. And still the adze rises and falls, and the shavings continue to curl away from the steel and pile up on the deck, and the canvas sack continues to fill, its shape growing rounder and its weight growing heavier, while the carpenter works on into the endless night, his steady hands producing a harvest of thin, pale ribbons that gleam in the lamplight, and rustle in the cold air, and carry with them the faint, fading scent of a forest that is now unimaginably far away. The carpenter's hands hold your attention now, as steady as the lantern flames and as familiar as the grain of the spruce. They are the hands of a man who has worked with wood for more years than he can count, and the story of those years is written across them in a language of scars and calluses and the deep, settled patterns of muscle memory. You watch the hands rather than the adze itself, because the adze is only the instrument. The hands are what give it purpose, what guide the blade through each cut with a precision that requires no thought. The left hand grips the handle close to the steel socket, the thumb wrapped securely around the curve, the knuckles slightly raised because the grip is firm but not clenched. The right hand curls around the butt of the handle, the three bare fingers resting on the worn hickory, while the mitten's cut-off edge flutters slightly with each swing. Between the two hands, the distance never varies, a span learned over decades and maintained without measurement. The skin of the carpenter's hands tells its own quiet story, one that you have come to know through many hours of watching. The palms are covered with calluses, not the raw, blistered calluses of a novice, but the smooth, dense pads of a man who has held tools since he was a boy. The calluses are thickest at the base of the fingers and along the pad below the thumb, the places where the handle of the adze presses most firmly during the swing, and they have a polished look, almost like old leather that has been burnished by years of use. The backs of the hands are weathered and brown, the skin creased with fine lines that deepen when he flexes his fingers, and the veins run across the backs of the hands in raised blue cords, more prominent in the left hand than the right, because the left hand does the harder work of controlling the blade. The knuckles are prominent, the joints slightly enlarged from a lifetime of gripping and lifting and pounding, and when the carpenter straightens his fingers after a long series of strokes, the knuckles crackle softly, a sound like the snapping of small dry twigs underfoot. The fingernails are short and clean, trimmed with the same knife the carpenter uses for cutting twine, and the fingertips are protected by the dense skin that grows from constant contact with rough wood and cold steel. These bare fingertips, exposed to the Arctic air while the rest of the hand stays wrapped in wool, are reddened with cold, but seem to feel no discomfort. They touch the adze blade to test its sharpness, stroke the spruce to check the smoothness of a cut, grip the tiny brass screw on the wick snuffers, and feel the temperature of the lantern glass. They are the hands of a blind man in their sensitivity, registering information that the eyes cannot perceive. The invisible roughness of a nearly smooth surface, the minute vibration of a blade that has begun to dull, the temperature shift that warns of a tool growing too cold to hold safely. The carpenter's motions with the adze are not the motions of a man who's thinking about what he is doing. They are the motions of a man whose body has learned the work so thoroughly that the thinking part of his mind can go somewhere else entirely. This is the gift of 40 years at the bench and at sea, the transformation of a difficult skill into an automatic function as natural as walking or breathing. The carpenter does not decide where to place the next stroke. His left hand already knows, moving the blade a finger's width to the left without any conscious command. He does not calculate the force of the swing. His right hand already knows, applying exactly the pressure needed to take a shaving of the desired thickness from this particular patch of grain. The hands work together in a partnership that predates language, a collaboration so deep that they might be two halves of a single instrument. You think about the time that is passing, the hours of the endless night that are being consumed by this steady, repetitive labor. The ship's bell rings the half hour, then the hour, then the next half hour, and the sound of the bell is the only way you have of marking time's passage. The sun will not rise to separate one day from the next. The stars wheel overhead in a sky that is perpetually black, but you cannot see them through the overcast that has hung above the ship for weeks. Time, in this frozen darkness, has become something that is measured not by clocks, but by the carpenter's strokes, by the number of shavings in the sack, by the slowly rounding shape of the spruce timber. A minute is not 60 seconds, a minute is 20 strokes of the adze. An hour is not 60 minutes. An hour is a full sweep of the blade along one face of the beam, the conversion of a flat plane into a curved arc. The carpenter's awareness of time is different even from yours, more deeply embedded in the work itself. When he pauses to straighten his back and flex his fingers, he does not do it because a clock tells him to rest. He does it because his body tells him that a certain number of strokes have passed, that the muscle in his right shoulder has tightened to a particular degree, that the pad below his left thumb has compressed to a certain depth. His body is a timepiece as accurate as any chronometer, its springs and gears made of tendon and bone, and the neural pathways that fire in sequence with each swing of the adze. He could not tell you how much time has passed since the mid-watch tea, because he has not been measuring time in that way. But if you asked him how many feet of the timber have been rounded since the tea, he could show you without hesitation, running his hand along the curved surface to mark the progress. The carpenter's memory is stored in his hands as much as in his head, a physical knowledge that bypasses words and concepts. If you were to wake him from a deep sleep and place an adze in his hands and a squared timber at his feet, his body would begin the work before his mind had fully surfaced from its dreams. The hands remember the weight of the tool, the angle of the cut, the rhythm of the swing, the sound of the blade meeting the grain. The carpenter himself, the man behind the hands, might be far away in his thoughts, back in the shipyard where he first apprenticed, walking the streets of a port town that no longer exists, seeing the faces of people who have long since passed out of his life. But his hands remain here, on this frozen deck, continuing the work with a fidelity that requires no attention. There is a word for this state, a word that the carpenter might not know, but that describes his condition precisely: craft. Craft is not the same as skill, though it includes skill. Skill is knowing how to do something. Craft is knowing how to do it so well that the doing becomes a form of being. The carpenter is not merely adze in a timber. He is being a carpenter, inhabiting the role as completely as a fish inhabits water, and the role shapes him as much as he shapes the wood. His posture, his breathing, his way of looking at the world, even his silences, are all expressions of the craft that has formed him over decades of patient labor. When he sets down the adze and picks up the draw knife later in the night, he will do so without any sense of transition, because the transition is not between tools, but between different aspects of the same continuous act of making. The relationship between the carpenter and time is not the relationship of a man trying to finish a task. There is no hurry in his movements, no sense that he is racing against the ship's bell, or the calendar, or the slow dwindling of the lamp oil. The mast will be finished when it is finished, and the carpenter will work on it until it is done, and the darkness will continue regardless. This acceptance of time's pace, this refusal to rush or to count the hours, is a form of wisdom that the sea has taught to every person who has ever sailed upon it. The sea does not hurry, and neither does the ice, and neither does the wood under the adze. To hurry would be to fight against the nature of things, and the carpenter has learned, through years of practice, that fighting against the nature of things is the one sure way to do bad work. The crew, sleeping in their bunks below, know the carpenter's rhythm even in their dreams. They have heard it for so many nights now, the steady thunk and slice filtering down through the deck beams and into the foxley, that it has become part of their sleep, a metronome that rocks them gently in their hammocks and bunks. When the carpenter eventually stops for the night, some of the crew will stir in their sleep, missing the rhythm that has been a constant presence since they first lay down. The new crewmen, the ones who shipped aboard for this single voyage and have never wintered in the ice before, were puzzled by the sound when they first heard it, unable to identify the source of the soft, repeating noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But now, weeks into the endless night, they sleep through it as soundly as the veterans, their bodies having accepted the adze's rhythm as a natural part of the environment. Like the creak of the ice or the tick of the cooling stove, you settle deeper into your folded sailcloth and let your own breathing slow to match the carpenter's strokes. There is a kind of time that exists only in the body, a time that has nothing to do with bells or chronometers or the rotation of the earth. It is the time of the heartbeat, the time of the breath, the time of the muscles contracting and releasing in a steady cycle of work and rest. The carpenter lives in this bodily time, and you, by watching him so closely for so long, have begun to enter it yourself. The lanterns burn, and the adze falls, and the shavings curl away from the steel, and the ship's bell rings in the distance, but you hardly notice it anymore. The only time that matters now is the time of the hands, the time of the wood, the time of the rhythm that carries you gently toward the end of the watch, and the return to your bunk. The carpenter pauses, as he does every few minutes, to brush the shavings from the deck and guide them into the canvas sack. He flexes his fingers, and you see the way the joints open and close, the way the tendons slide beneath the skin like cables under a tarpaulin. The hands rest for a moment on his thighs, the left hand still gripping the adze loosely, the right hand splayed open with the palm facing upward. The calluses catch the lantern light and gleam dully, polished patches of skin that have felt the handles of 1,000 tools in 1,000 different places. The carpenter looks at his hands, not with vanity or concern, but with the calm, assessing gaze of a man checking a familiar instrument before continuing the work. Whatever he sees satisfies him, because after a few seconds he resettles his grip, shifts his knees on the burlap pad, and raises the adze for the first stroke of a new series. And the hands continue their work, as they have done through this watch and the watches before it, as they will do through the watches to come until the mast is shaped and the ice breaks, and the ship sails south again into the sun. They are the hands of a carpenter, and they are the hands that hold time steady in a place where time has forgotten itself, and they move through the endless night with the slow, unerring certainty of a tide returning to the shore. The timber has changed so gradually that you cannot pinpoint the moment when it stopped being a squared beam and became a mast. The transformation has been happening all night, stroke by stroke, shaving by shaving, while the lanterns burned and the ship breathed and the tea steamed and cooled. Now, as the carpenter sets down the roughing adze and reaches for a different tool, you see the mast clearly for the first time. A long, tapering cylinder of pale spruce that glows in the lamplight like a column of honey. The square corners that defined the beam when it was first lifted from the hold are entirely gone, replaced by a smooth, continuous curve that runs from the thick butt end to the narrower head, and the surface, though still carrying the faint scalloped texture of the adze facets, is so even that your eye can follow it from end to end without catching on a single irregularity. The carpenter kneels at the head end of the mast, where the diameter has been reduced to fit through the mast cap and carry the topmast rigging, and he opens his tool roll with the same deliberate movements he has used all night. From the roll he selects a different adze, a smaller tool with a blade only 2 inches wide and a handle that has been shortened to allow more control. This finishing adze is lighter than the roughing tool, its blade ground to a finer edge, and the carpenter holds it differently. His left hand grips the handle directly behind the blade socket, his fingers almost touching the steel, while his right hand rests lightly at the butt. The swing he uses with this tool is shorter and more precise, a flick of the wrist rather than a sweep of the arm, and the shavings it produces are paper-thin, so delicate that they float rather than fall, drifting sideways in the cold air before settling on the deck like snowflakes. With the finishing adze, he works his way along the mast from the head to the butt, taking strokes that remove no more than a whisper of wood at a time. His purpose now is not to shape but to fair the surface, blending the tiny facets left by the rough adze into a smooth, flowing curve. He pauses frequently to sight along the mast from end to end, one eye closed and his head tilted, checking the line of the taper for any flat spots or hollows. The lantern light rakes across the surface at a low angle, revealing every minute variation in the contour, every tiny rise or dip that his hands must correct. When he finds a spot that needs attention, he marks it with a faint scratch from the corner of his chisel, then returns with the finishing adze and removes the mark 3 or 4 strokes, then sight again, then perhaps one more stroke until the line is true. This final shaping is the slowest part of the work, the most demanding of patience and attention, and the carpenter gives it freely. He has been working for many hours, his knees aching on the burlap pad, his fingers numb with cold, his shoulders heavy with the accumulated fatigue of thousands of adze strokes. But you see no sign of hurry in his movements. The mast deserves the same care at the end as it received at the beginning, and the carpenter would not shorten the process even if the sun were about to rise and the ice about to break and the ship about to sail for home. The work is the work, and time is only the medium in which the work takes place. After the finishing adze has done all it can, the carpenter sets it aside and takes up the draw knife. This tool is entirely different in character. A long, straight blade with 2 wooden handles set at right angles to the ends, meant to be pulled toward the user rather than swung. The carpenter straddles the mast near its middle, sits back on his heels, and draws the knife along the grain in smooth, even passes, the blade peeling away gossamer shavings that curl up over his knuckles and drop into his lap. The sound of the draw knife is not the hollow thunk of the adze, but a soft, silky hiss, a continuous note that rises and falls with each pull. The carpenter works the draw knife around the full circumference of the mast, blending the adze facets into a surface that is nearly smooth to the touch, and the spruce begins to glow with a soft luster as the knife burnishes the fibers. Next comes the plane, a wooden-bodied tool with a steel blade set at an angle in a block of beech. The carpenter adjusts the blade depth with a tap of a small hammer, then sends the plane along the mast in long rhythmic strokes that cover the full length of his reach. The plane removes shavings of an even greater fineness than the draw knife, transparent ribbons that float like spider silk and settle on the deck in tangled piles, and the sound it makes is a steady, satisfying whoosh that seems to pull the mast into its final shape as much by sound as by steel. The carpenter planes the entire surface twice, first along the grain and then against it, checking with his bare palm after each pass, feeling for any roughness that only his skin can detect. The wood under his hand grows warmer with the friction of the plane, and a faint, fresh scent of spruce rises from the newly exposed surface. When the planing is done, the carpenter retrieves the wooden calipers from his tool roll and measures the diameter of the mast at 4 separate points, comparing each measurement to the chalk marks he made on the deck planks earlier in the night. The calipers open and close on their brass pivots, the curved arms enfolding the mast and then releasing it, and the carpenter reads the worn markings with a squint and a nod. The butt end must fit exactly into the mast step on the keelson. A mortise cut into a massive timber far below the waterline, and the diameter must be within a 1/16 of an inch of the specification, or the mast will be loose and dangerous when the ship is under sail. The carpenter measures, checks, measures again, and then makes a tiny adjustment with the plane on one side of the butt, removing a shaving so thin that it is barely visible, before measuring once more and nodding to himself with quiet satisfaction. The head end of the mast receives similar attention because it must pass through the mast cap and carry the sheave for the topmast halyard. The carpenter takes a chisel from his roll, a narrow-bladed tool with a bevel on one side, and cuts a shallow mortise near the head, a rectangular slot that will house a wooden pulley called a sheave. The mortise must be exactly centered and exactly sized, the sheave fitting snugly but without binding, and the carpenter works with the care of a jeweler, setting a stone, testing the fit with the sheave itself, a lignum vitae wheel that he has kept in his pocket to keep it warm and free of frost. He pares the mortise walls a fraction at a time, the chisel whispering through the spruce, until the sheave drops into place with a soft, precise click that is the most satisfying sound of the night. The mast is now complete as a single piece of shaped wood, but it is not yet ready to be stepped. The carpenter rubs the entire surface with a handful of raw linseed oil from a stone jar, working the oil into the spruce with circular motions of his palm, and the wood drinks the oil greedily, darkening to a rich, golden brown that seems to capture the lantern lights and hold it inside. The oil will protect the spruce from the wet and the sun when the ship finally sails again, and it will also allow the mast to flex under load without cracking, the fibers sliding against each other on a microscopic film of oil. The carpenter works the oil into every inch of the surface, even the end grain of the butt and the head, and when he is done the mast gleams softly in the lamplight like a polished piece of furniture. You have been watching this final stage of the work from your sailcloth seat, your body still and your breath slow, and you feel a quiet sense of completion that is not your own, but seems to emanate from the carpenter himself. He does not smile, does not speak, does not make any gesture of triumph or relief, but there is a subtle change in the set of his shoulders, a slight easing of the tension that has held him in his working posture for so many hours. He runs his hand along the mast one last time, from butt to head and back again, and then he nods, a small, private acknowledgement, and begins to gather his tools. The adzes go back into their leather sheaths, the draw knife is wiped clean and wrapped in its cloth, the chisels are tucked into their separate pockets in the tool roll, the calipers are folded and stored, the whetstone is returned to its pouch, the mallet is placed beside the chocks. The carpenter moves slowly now, the fatigue evident in the careful way he bends his knees and the way he pauses between each action to flex his fingers and roll his shoulders. But his hands remain steady and his attention does not waver. The tools must be put away properly, each in its place, so that when he returns to the deck for the next project, he will find everything where he expects it. This discipline is as much a part of the work as the adzing, and he observes it without complaint. The finished mast lies on the chocks, oiled and gleaming, a perfect cylinder of spruce that seems almost too beautiful to hide inside a ship's rigging. The carpenter lifts one end and you rise to help, taking the head while he takes the butt, and together you carry the mast to the bulwark where a section of the rail has been removed to make a stowage slot. The mast slides into place against the inner planking, its oiled surface protected by a canvas cover that the carpenter ties in place with short lengths of tarred line, knotting each tie with the same precision he applies to everything else. The cover will keep the frost from settling on the wood and the lantern soot from staining the oiled surface, and when the time comes to step the mast it will be clean and ready. With the mast stowed and the tools put away, the carpenter turns to the lanterns. He reaches up and turns the wick knob on the first lantern, lowering the flame until it is a tiny blue bead, then extinguishes it with a soft puff of breath that you barely hear. The darkness on that side of the deck closes in immediately, the pool of light shrinking by half, and suddenly the workspace seems smaller and colder. The carpenter takes the second lantern down from its stay and holds it in one hand, the handle looped over his wrist, and he looks across the deck at you. His face, lit from below by the remaining lantern flame, is tired but calm, the lines around his eyes deepened by the long hours, but his gaze clear and steady. He says nothing, but the slight lift of his chin is an invitation to follow, and you rise from your sailcloth for the last time this night. You help him gather the last few items, the canvas sack of shavings, now nearly full, which he hefts over his shoulder, the burlap knee pad, which he rolls and tucks under his arm, the stoneware oil jug, which you carry because your hands are free. The carpenter crosses to the companionway hatch and descends the ladder first, the lantern casting a moving circle of light on the rungs and the walls, and you follow him down, your boots finding the rungs by feel where the light does not reach. The cold eases slightly as you descend, the air growing heavier and stiller, and the smell of the lower decks rises to meet you. The faint mingled odors of cooking, lamp oil, wool, and the ever-present wood. The carpenter stows the lantern on its hook in the main passageway, where it will burn through the remainder of the watch to light the way for any crewman who needs to move about the ship, and then he turns toward his own quarters, a small cabin tucked aft near the steerage. He pauses at his door and looks back at you, and you exchange a nod, the same nod you've exchanged at the end of every watch, a wordless acknowledgement of shared time and shared quiet. Then he disappears into his cabin. The door closes softly, and you are alone in the passageway. You continue forward to your own berth in the forecastle, walking slowly, your legs heavy with sitting and your eyes adjusted to the dim light. The ship around you is almost silent now, the sounds of the adze replaced by the familiar creaking and snapping of the hull, the distant stamp of the lookout's feet, the soft cluck of the hens near the galley. You climb into your bunk, your body recognizing the familiar shape of the mattress and the blankets, and you pull the covers up around your shoulders without bothering to remove more than your boots and your outer coat. The lamp still burns beside your bunk, its flame turned low, and you watch it for a little while, the tiny pendulum swing, the soft amber glow on the overhead beam. The mast is finished. Tomorrow, or what passes for tomorrow in this endless night, the crew will gather on deck and step it into place, heaving on the tackles and guiding the butt into the step, and the ship will have a new topmast ready for the day when the ice breaks and the sails are set again. But that work belongs to another watch, and for now the only thing that matters is the warmth of the blankets and the deep settling quiet of the ship. The adze is silent, the carpenter is asleep, the lanterns are dimmed, and the endless night continues its patient vigil outside the hull, as still and dark as it has been since the beginning of the world. You close your eyes, and behind your eyelids you can still see the arc of the adze, the curl of the shavings, the glow of the spruce under the lantern light. The rhythm of the work replays in your mind like a fading echo, thunk and slice, a lullaby that carries you down into sleep. The ship holds you in its wooden embrace, the ice grips the hull, the cold stands watch at the hatch, and you sleep, breathing slowly, at peace in the frozen dark.